Welcome to Lead Poison.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Lead Poison podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by jgwpainting.com.au. For all your painting and decorating needs, servicing Sydney and surrounds, please visit jgwpainting.com.au to get a quote today. Thank you for joining me. I am happy to announce we have Lead Poison clothing now available on our website at www.leadpoison.com.au. If you enjoy the show and want some fresh gear, head over to the clothing tab and buy yourself or a friend a shirt. And of course, as well as a fresh tee, you'll be supporting independent podcast production and all the work we are doing at Lead Poison to deliver meaningful and interesting conversations to my fellow misfits. I want to thank everyone who listens, and to all the people reaching out, I appreciate the feedback very much. Again, hit the link in today's show notes to visit www.leadpoison.com.au and grab yourself a t-shirt in solidarity with our push to lift up the huge creative community in this country. My name is Jack, your host, and this evening on the show we are joined by Dr Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. Arthur is a medical doctor, a former politician who served as a member of the Legislative Council of New South Wales from 1998 to 2007, and I guess notably pertinent to the Lead Poison podcast, a member of Billboard Utilising Graffitists against unhealthy promotions, otherwise known as BUGAUP. BUGAUP were a group of medical professionals, among others, who after growing tired of witnessing firsthand the devastating effects of fast food, alcohol, and tobacco, coupled with the prolific large-scale advertising that at the time was inescapable, decided to use spray cans and alter billboards in an attempt to reveal the true face of these dirty and disgraceful companies. Behind the scenes, doctors were dealing with a tsunami of lifestyle-caused disease, horrific case after horrific case, sanctioned, marketed, and in fact encouraged by the Goliaths inhabiting the industries of death, destruction, and despair. This was the 1980s, and although since then the advertising may be gone, the problem still exists. Arthur spent 20 plus years of his professional life fighting for the Australian people and their health, both through his work as a doctor and in the political arena. In 1988, Arthur presented a short documentary titled Confessions of a Simple Surgeon. The film is available on YouTube and through the link in today's show notes. The work Arthur has done to speak out against tobacco in particular, but also a wide range of other social and political issues throughout his career, and still to this day, is nothing short of a truly honourable feat. During the conversation I mentioned a book. It's called Alan Carr's Easy Way. This is by far and away the most effective method I have ever come across in breaking down the myth and psychological trap of smoking. And make no mistake, although the physical addiction to nicotine is real, it is extremely easy to overcome. The psychological component of the addiction is what needs to be understood. Quit campaigns would like you to believe that quitting smoking is physically hard. And although their work is commendable, this couldn't be further from the truth. The key lies in the mental conditioning delivered with the product. In my past, I have to and froed with several addictions, none more mentally challenging than that of the smoking conundrum. If I was to be honest and bring full disclosure to today's conversation, I am dealing with the current vaping problem that seems to be extremely prevalent. I'm not saying any of this to shit on smokers or people that vape. I'm only trying to be fully honest to my listeners, and I guess most importantly, I want people who may be struggling with tobacco just like I have, to know that with some focused effort and a pinch of self-respect, most of life's problems can be overcome. Anyways, I'm beginning to sound a bit like a false guru. Regardless, I want to thank Dr Chesterfield-Evans for his time and insights, and of course, I hope you enjoy the discussion. Please rate, subscribe, and leave a review on whatever platform you're using, and find the relevant links in today's show notes. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans.
My name's Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. I'm a medical doctor, although I've probably done more useful things politically. I started off with a good education in a boarding school. And my lesson from that was people in charge aren't necessarily looking after your welfare. You know, they are running a hierarchy here. And so my main object when I chose a career, and they told me I should be a barrister because I was good at debating, was I thought, well, I just want a job where I've been told what to do for 10 years. I want a job where nobody can tell me what to do. I thought, well, even if I'm a really bad doctor, I'll still have an income. No one will be able to tell me what to do. So it was kind of a negative decision to go into medicine. My father was a doctor and he was a bit hassled by it all. But I thought, well, I don't have to be hassled like he was. You know, I can just, as long as I've got an income. Because I thought the main thing you have to do in life is to be free. And you can't be free if you don't have enough money to live on, right? So that's seemed. So I went into medicine, which is an interesting field. I'm not saying anything wrong with it. It's a worthy cause. So I went into it not particularly because I was mad about helping people. I was basically wanting a decent income. I wanted to do decent things by people and I wanted independence, right? So I went into medicine and I studied away and I got through no troubles. So I ended up in the hospital system. And of course, you know, you rotate through various training positions, you know, as you're a resident medical officer. So everywhere I went, I couldn't help noticing there was disease caused by tobacco, and tobacco was the major cause. It sounds bizarre, the major cause of disease as far as I was concerned. Like I went to the medical ward and it was full of emphysema patients coughing away. And so then I went to the head and neck surgery ward and all the face cancers, mouth cancers, tongue cancers, larynx cancers, all in smokers. There weren't any pretty much in non-smokers. Then I went to the orthopedic ward and the spontaneous fractures were in all the people who had chronic bronchitis because, of course, it eats away the calcium in the bones. And so, and also even the young guys who smoked would heal more slowly, the motorbike accidents or whatever, even they would heal more slowly if they were smokers. Then I went to the vascular ward where we were cutting off the legs of the smokers because the arteries to the legs were gone. Then I went to the cardiothoracic ward and all the lung cancer was caused by smoking and all the premature heart attacks were were in smokers, like all the people having their heart attacks in their 50s were smokers. Then I went to the urology ward, you know, which is mostly people with prostate problems, but all the bladder cancers and kidney cancers were in smokers. So, I mean, it was like everywhere I went, there was tobacco-caused disease. And the doctors sort of said, oh, well, nothing you do about it, you know, it just gets served up here and we treat it, you know. But when you look at the success rate of, say, lung cancer, it's pretty dismal, you know. 5 years later, not many of them are still alive, you know. And the chronic bronchitis is, you know, you can go there and give them drugs all nights and days and they can't stop smoking and so on. So it all seemed insane to me, you know. So, you know, and the doctors were aware of it, but they wouldn't really, I mean, at that stage you could still smoke in hospital wards, you know, I mean, like it was, they asked you not to smoke in bed. That was about the limit, you know, and everyone else just went out they all went out to the dunny or on the veranda and smoked. I mean, like it was, you could smoke anywhere, of course. I mean, people forget this. You could smoke anywhere you liked. If you went to somebody's house, you just lit up and said, where's your ashtray? You know, like it was assumed that this was a normal behaviour, right? I mean, it hasn't been for, 20 years now or maybe more than that. But at that time, that's how it was, you know, and of course, the cigarette advertising was everywhere. And it seemed to me insane. Anyway, I hadn't worried too much about tobacco when I was a student because if you just said tobacco caused a disease, you got an extra mark, you know, because what's the cause of this disease? Smoking. Oh, yeah, well, of course, you know, got a mark there, no sweat, you know. But when I was actually seeing all this disease, I thought, and when I went into intensive care, it was even worse. All the people who had, because intensive care is about when your lungs and your heart stop working right, or they don't work very well, right? All the people who were young and had endless problems, compounded problems, multiple problems, they were all smokers too. So it was just like, you know, and I had a bloke once, I'd sawn off one of his legs because he'd had arterial disease in his legs, you know. I sawed off his legs and I said to him, oh, geez, mate, look, I said, you've got to stop smoking. He had terrible lungs as well, terrible heart as well, and his leg happened to go first, you know what I mean? So I cut off one leg. I said, look, mate, if you don't stop smoking, I'll have to cut off the other leg. And he said, oh, you doctors, you're always on about smoking, but if it was that bad, the government would do something about it. And I thought, well, that's crazy, But then I thought, he's actually right. For most things, if there's something really bad, you assume the government will do something about it because that's what they're there for, right? I mean, that's what they're there for. But his thing was, well, the doctors are all on about it. It's like it's an eccentricity of doctors that they go on about this, like it's not a fact that's proven because it's like saying, if I said to you, your tomato sauce bottle is poisoned, and you'd say, no, it's not. And I'd say, how do you know that? And you say, well, the government wouldn't let it be poisoned. There'd be some regulation somewhere that someone would inspect it and someone would check it and there wouldn't be any poison in my tomato sauce bottle, right? So in a sense, his logic was actually quite sound, that you would expect something done about it. So anyway, eventually, I kind of put tobacco caused disease together. I thought, what? That's causing all these diseases. How does it work? And I thought, well, you inhale a cigarette, right? And it's got, let's say, 5 components. It's got hot air. It's got particles of, gunk. It's got carbon monoxide. It's got nicotine to make it addictive, and it's got tar. So as it goes in, all this hot gases and tar causes cancer in your mouth, tongue, and down into your lungs, right? That's what you might call the input cancers as it goes into your body, right? And then the tars and the nicotine and the carbon monoxide goes into your body through the lungs. And the carbon monoxide poisons the cells that line your arteries. So you've got those cells get damaged and the fat in the arteries sticks to the wall, right? So you're gradually blocking your arteries from your smoking. And the nicotine is addictive, but it also constricts the arteries. So it puts your blood pressure up, makes the flow more difficult in the arteries. So that also contributes to the arterial disease. So you're buggering up every artery in your body, right? You've also got the tar goes in. So the tar goes into your body and goes around your body, and it causes leukemias and lymphomas, right? I forgot to mention those. And then it comes out of your body, and it comes out in the sweat glands, so you can smell smokers because it's all coming out of your body. And then it comes out in all the secretion. So it's in your saliva, it's in your pancreatic secretion, and so you get more cancer of the salivary glands, you get more cancer of your pancreas. It comes out in the breasts, so you get more breast cancer. It comes out in your urine, so you get more kidney and bladder cancer. It comes out in your prostate, so you get more prostate cancer. If you're a woman, it comes out in your vaginal secretion, so you get more cervical cancer. Right? So you've got all these cancers caused by the tars going in, going round and coming out. Then you've got all the arterial diseases, that's strokes, heart attacks, and, impotence, which is the most important thing from men's point of view. There's no lead in the pencil, as it were. And then if you're actually talking to middle-aged men, that is the most important thing to mention. Heart attacks, strokes, they can deal with. Even chopping your legs off, they can deal with. But impotence, you want to talk to middleaged men? Talk about impotence. Right?
Gets their attention.
So that was when I was trying to do quit programs in the workplace that I discovered that later. But so that's the picture of the tobacco-caused diseases and the extensiveness of it, and of course, I didn't mention the emphysema, which is from all the particles and garbage going into your lungs as well. And that's a very significant component as well. So you've got all these diseases. So I figured all this out and I thought, Jesus, something's got to be done about this. And the doctors were saying, oh, nothing you can do, nothing we can do. We just fix it, right? Well, of course, they can't fix it. So it was ridiculous. So I was mentioning this at a party that I was at, because I was working as a cardiac person at North Shore. And it goes, oh, you should join the Liberal Party, it's a broad church. And I said, well, are they going to do anything? Oh, we're a broad church, we always want input from, bright young people like you. And I said, okay. So I joined the Liberal Party. But as I was doing that, I was working at North Shore, and a couple of cases that really got me fired up, I guess. There was a guy, he was 39, and he had cancer at the back of the tongue. So anyway, we had a visiting professor from Glasgow there at the time. And the treatment at that time was that you cut the tongue out and the floor of the mouth out, and you took a piece of skin from your shoulder, and you brought up a flap of muscle, your pectoral muscle from your chest, and with the skin on the end of it, and you stuck that in your mouth. And that, of course, the flap of muscle from your chest kept the bit of skin alive in your mouth until the blood vessels grew into it, and then you could cut the muscle off and put it back where it came from, if you see what I mean. And so you would have actually transferred the shoulder into to form the floor of your mouth. So this professor from Glasgow was having a go at this, and away he went. Anyway, it doesn't work very well because a normal muscle in your mouth, you've got muscles that contract and clean themselves out and stuff. But if you've just got a lump of
shoulder
skin there, needless to say, all the food gets caught in it and it just goes off and smells. So this guy, the smell of him would kill a brown dog. So he was in a private room with his smelly mouth, right? But if that wasn't enough, the flap died, so that in fact it all then rotted inside his mouth. And if that wasn't enough, the report came back from the pathologist that the excision was incomplete and there was still cancer in the other half of his tongue, right? So there's this guy, 39 years old, completely up the creek, heavy smoker, of course. He had a 31-year-old wife and an 18-month-old baby, you know, and everyone's avoiding him because the smell's too bad. And I thought, Jesus, if ever a bloke was buggered, you know, this is pretty bad stuff, you know. It's all caused by tobacco. So, but wow, I think that's when I started talking to the political people and saying, this is really something's got to be done about this. But the final straw was, I was doing cardiac surgery this time. I'd finished the head and neck term and I was doing cardiac surgery. And this bloke came in and he's 52, maybe 52. And he was a businessman, very smooth, well-dressed, civilised, smoked Benson and Hedges because, of course, they were the prestige brand. And he had a big heart attack, big. And we always used to look at the angiograms, you know, putting dye in the heart. And when one half of his heart contracted, the other half blew out like a balloon, so that in fact the heart was sort of, half of it was contracting and half of it was expanding at the same time. So of course, the amount of blood coming out of it wasn't very much, you know, it was pretty bad. And so it just happened that I got to talk to him more than usual. Usually it was such a rush you couldn't talk to someone, but it just happened the day before when he came in, I had a little bit of time to talk to him, saw what a nice guy he was, you know. And he had a nice wife, very young, probably 38, 39, and some kids. They were, I suppose, a couple of girls, about 11 and 13, and they all came and said, we're visiting ours, and I said hello to them. So anyway, we went to operate next day, of course, and I was, you know, put him on the bypass machine and, you know, did the surgery, and his heart was really marginal, you know, and we went back to intensive care because, of course, once they went back to intensive care, that was my job to look after them till, you know, overnight. And he had a balloon pump, which was the technology at the time. It was sort of an extra pump to try and make the heart work a bit harder. So it went up the aorta and it expanded and contracted when the heart didn't, so that it actually added extra volume, if you like, to the pulse. So there he was with all this gear, and he was really hard. He wasn't going very well. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, his heart stopped. And I'd been using all the drugs and protocols as much as I could. Anyway, his heart stopped, so I started pumping him and pumping his chest, and I rang the boss, and the boss said, he said, oh, look, open up his chest and pump him by hand, and I'll come in as fast as I can. Right? So I took the wire cutters and opened up his chest, and I was pumping his heart in my hands, you know. And the boss came in and he said, what did you do? And I described what had happened, you know, how his output had gradually gone down, his blood pressure had gone down. I'd put in more of the chemicals and stuff that was and infusions that were supposed to help him. The balloon pump was working okay. And he said, oh, you've done all the right things. There's nothing you can do here. So he put the heart down, pulled the drape over the guy's head and said, oh, you go and talk to the relatives. So I went outside, and there was his wife and his kids sitting in the corridor. And the lights were dimmed because it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and they only had the minimum number on, so fire escape numbers. So she was kind of almost in the dark. We were standing under the pool of light, and the tears were streaming down her face. And the two daughters, the same. They were a lovely family, really. Why has this happened? Like I knew the answer to that question. And I thought, it's bloody Benson Hedges, what do you think? But I didn't say that. I said, it's just one of those things that happens, which wasn't true. It happens because of Benson Hedges, right? Tobacco caused death, right? So anyway, they were very upset. So, I spoke to them, and I went to bed. And then the next day I was off the next evening, because we used to work alternate nights, right? We were on call alternate nights. Well, I'd been up nearly all night with this guy because I didn't get to bed about 4 o'clock in the morning. So I went out with my girlfriend. I was going out with my girlfriend the next night, and I said, "Look, I just want to go to sleep. I'm absolutely dead." And she said, "Oh, you always, you always want to go to sleep. You never." You want to go to sleep? I said, "Well, that's because I've had no sleep the night before,
How dare you?
So, you promised we'd go to the movies. You promised. I said, "Oh, okay, we'll go to the movies." So we went off to George Street to the movies, And as we went into the movies, all the kids were smoking outside, right? All these kids, from about the age of 10 on, they're all these kids smoking. So we walked through all these smoking kids, and I thought, Jesus, here's the next generation coming along for this. And we got in, sat down in the movies, and the Marlboro Man rode on, because they still had cigarette ads at that time. And I thought, Jesus, this is how it all happens,
That must have been really strange to get those two different sides of those contrasting sort of messages from them. That must have been really strange.
Well, I thought, I'm going to stop this. It kills me. I am going to stop this happening, So that's when I started, and I started talking to I joined the Liberal Party at some point. I can't remember if it was before or after that, but and I was not really getting anywhere there, And I went to a Young Liberal conference, which was in Melbourne actually, and I had a motion before the conference which all cigarette advertising should be banned. Like, that was my motion. And the guys who had all the power, the little clique who had the power, and they told everyone what to do and so on. They said, "Oh yes, we can get it through for you, Arthur, but you have to have sponsorship as an exemption." And I thought, hang on, sponsorship means they pay the rugby league. They don't pay the TV station, they pay the rugby league, and the rugby league puts all the ads there.
And they appear anyways.
And they appear anyway, and they're cheaper because they only have to pay the rugby league. They don't have to pay for the TV time. So in fact, they get more exposure for less price. And we're putting in this in an exemption. So in fact, what the motion I'm passing is actually useless, right? And indeed, that went into legislation in 1976 with Malcolm Fraser, I think, but again with the exemption for sponsorship.
Wow.
So then I started talking within the Liberal Party about how something needed to be done. And I remember this old guy who was the old fart from Central Casting. If you said, show me a what do you say? Central Casting old fart, right? With jowls, a red face and a pot gut and smug and, and I said, look, something could be about tobacco advertising. This party's really got to do something about it. And he said, look here, Sonny, they give us $250,000 a year. And I said, oh, it's $250,000 a year the price of the Liberal Party in New South Wales, is it? And he said, you won't get anywhere with attitudes like that, Sonny.
Wow.
Which was true. He was definitely right on that one. Anyway, I had joined the Health and Welfare Policy Subcommittee because I thought, I'm going to get in there and change the policy, right? So I'd written this policy on, I did two policies, one on hard drugs and one on tobacco, right? So I took it into this committee, and I'd written it all up, and I'd, you know, worded them up and handed it out and put it in the minutes, put it in the, you know, what do you call the proceedings, the agenda. And it had 13 points of what should be done, which was all taken from the WHO and the Union Against Cancer and stuff. And, you know, there was to be no smoking indoors, and there was to be, you know, education programs, and there was to be higher taxes, and there were to be no ads and no sponsorship, and 13 points. By the time the committee had finished, there were 4 points left, but it was still worth doing. And then they decided, oh, we can't just have Chesterfield-Evans here. We have to get the tobacco industry to come. So they invited the tobacco industry to come and do a presentation to the committee, for God's sake. And then they said, would you like Dr Chesterfield-Evans to leave while you do your presentation? And the tobacco industry guy, which was John Dollison, said, oh, no, he's busy on the committee. He should be able to be here to hear our presentation. So we heard the presentation about how nothing should be done. It was interfering in...
what could they possibly say?
Trade and commerce, was interfering in trade and commerce, and government shouldn't be big brother as far as businesses are concerned, blah, blah, blah. They're selling a legitimate product that wasn't illegal, blah, blah, blah. All the usual stuff. So anyway, I still have 4 points left and had to be discussed. And I can't honestly remember, it sounds ridiculous, whether the policy got up or not, but they said, well, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it has to go to the Joint Policy Committee. It's not, we just make recommendations to the Joint Policy Committee, and it determines the final policy of the Liberal Party. And I said, well, who's on that? And he said, oh, the chairman is Sir Robert Crichton Brown. He's the chairman of Rothmans.
You're kidding?
Nah. And I thought, so he's got himself in this Joint Policy Committee to make absolutely certain
wow,
that there's nothing happening. So the meeting was at Parliament House, I remember, in one of the meeting rooms there. And I walked out into the evening, because it was an evening meeting. And I thought, this is a complete waste of time. I am never going to come back to the Liberal Party, and I am never, you know, there's no point in doing this, right?
Mm.
So anyway, I left the Liberal Party, and I rang up a bloke called Brian McBride, who was, he'd set up a thing called the Nonsmokers Movement. Now, Pat Hills had banned smoking in buses in about 1976. I might have the year wrong, but I think that's right, 76 or 77. And the bus driver never enforced it. And he used to ask the bus driver to enforce it. And the bus driver was a smoker and said, oh, you wanker, you know, I'm not going to do anything for that. And one day the bus driver came on to the bus as a passenger and lit up. And Brian said, please stop smoking, you know, perfectly well, you know, like they knew each other. He was the bus driver, and he'd come on to get up Brian's nose, basically. And he blew smoke on Brian, as in to say, ha, 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 you know, and the other people laughed. And Brian sued him for assault. And Brian won the case. No one would actually be a witness. So he got on the bus and subpoenaed all the people. The man in the brown coat, the man who sits on the left, he handed out the subpoenas. They went to court. They obeyed the subpoenas, amazingly enough. And they gave evidence that, as it happened, that, you know, yes, the guy did sit on the bus. Yes, he was the bus driver. Yes, he did deliberately blow smoke in his face. So he won the case, and he won $1. $1 damages, right? There was the point with the principal. He says, not the money, it's the principal, right? Yeah. Anyway, he was getting a bit of a hard time with abusive phone calls, because in those days, everyone had their name in the telephone book. So if you wanted to know where somebody was, you just looked up their name, and
of course, yeah.
There was their name, and you rang them up and you said you're a fine fellow or you're a wanker, depending on whatever, you know. So he'd set up the Nonsmokers Movement to give himself an appearance that he had lots of friends and people, and he was somewhat protected from the people who were going to abuse him, right? So anyway, I did the same. I just looked up his number in the phone book and rang him up. And so I joined the Nonsmokers Movement with him. And through them, because some of the people in the Nonsmokers Movement were also in BUGAUP. So I met the BUGAUP people through Brian and the Nonsmokers Movement.
Right, interesting. And there was a few people at the beginning besides Brian that sort of started BUGAUP, wasn't there?
Well, as I didn't, when I saw, at the time BUGAUP was active, and I thought, well, whatever is happening, they're the cutting edge, right? They were starting to win the propaganda war. And when I was at Non-Smokers, they were writing letters to the politicians all the time. And one day I went into the office, and we had sort of one desk in one of the environmental groups, because that's all we could afford. That's all non-smokers was a tiny little group, didn't, no money to pay a secretary. We hired a desk in one of the environmental groups offices. And so there it was. And there was a lady called Gail who was the secretary at the time. And she was going through these papers. And I said, oh, look, the minister's going to consider it and do something in September. And she said, no, I'm just sorting the mail. That's 5 years old, that letter. And I thought, well, that's right. We write letters. And he says, I'm going to do something in the future. And then the future comes and goes, and,
nothing happens.
And then you write again, and, he's going to do it next September or whenever. So I thought, wow, these bugger up people are the ones who are really cutting the ice. And I didn't know with bugger up, like I just saw them on the billboards, and they were doing funny things. Like you'd see a picture of a Marlboro with a horse, and the horse would have a speech bubble saying, "Pooh, this macho stinks," or they were mainly using humour, you see. And so that was the weapon that they were using. Like there was a boat. Sterling was one of the brands. The brand for the Prestige was Benson Hedges, and the slogan was, "Well, only the best will do." And so they would always have prestige settings, And then Sterling was also a brand from Amatil, which was British American tobacco. They owned Amatil. And they had a boat with Sterling was the brand for the people who weren't quite as rich as the gold of Benson and Hedges, but it was the people who would be if they could be. And so there was a great boat there with Sterling, I can't remember what the slogan was. And the bugger up guy said, "Wankers away," So there was it was very tongue in cheek, So they were obviously cutting the ice. And I thought, well, are they sort of lefties left over from the Vietnam War? Because of course, when the Vietnam War came, there was a great upsurge in graffiti right there. There hadn't been much graffiti until the Vietnam War. People felt so strongly about that, they started doing much more graffiti slogans than had ever been done before, because it was sort of life and death issue pretty much. So I didn't know if bugger up were all sort of crazy lefties from the Vietnam War, or if they were sort of student pranksters, who were just going to take the piss out of everybody, like a sort of university review, the sort of people who dump people in the nude in the middle of the Harbour Bridge on their 21st birthday, those sort of people. I thought, well, is it these people with a sense of humour, or is it the lefties? Anyway, I met some bugger up people, and they said things like, "Oh, well, we have to do this. It does some good, And I said, well, won't you get arrested? And they said, "Oh, yes, it's worth it. It's worth it. We have to do this because we will do a lot of good if we succeed." And the contrast was amazing, because I'd been in the surgeon's tea room with the cardiac surgeons, of course, and they were paid about $800 an operation. And the subject of how much they were paid came up, and one of the surgeons said, "Oh, yeah, we're paid $800 an operation, but we're worth it. That's what we do." And so they were saying we're worth $800 an operation. I was doing most of the operation for $12.50 actually per hour. So when they said 800, it was, if you get the idea of the relativities, you know what I mean. But then these guys were saying, "Oh, yeah, we might get arrested, but it's still worth it. Like, we're not just making no income, we're going backwards, in terms of." So it seemed to me the moral position was pretty unassailable all around. The tactic was being very successful by taking the piss out of them. Like they wanted to keep the fun, like the name bugger up had fun in it, and the satiric stuff was winning because it was correct, and B, it was funny. It was absurd. So it wasn't a question of were they doing the right thing. It was obviously they were doing the right thing, and obviously they were doing it very well, and obviously it was making a huge difference. So for me, the choice was, am I a gutless bastard going to sit here just being a doctor and, let someone else carry the campaign, or am I going to join it, right? I was too gutless to admit that I was gutless. So I took up my spray can, like I was... I couldn't say, "Oh, you're a wimp, you won't do anything, you just sit there and make your money and someone else will fix it," I thought I couldn't really do that. It's just a bit too gutless for words. So of course I took it. And I wasn't particularly good graffitist. I wasn't very creative. I wasn't very good with the spray can extension, you know. My slogans weren't, and I couldn't really be, I wasn't as funny either because quite apart from the fact I wasn't a great artist. But, you know, when I got arrested, I got a lot of publicity because I was the doctor doing this. And that, in a sense, gave it a lot of moral force, what I was saying, because I'd seen, and I could describe, you know, what the pathology was, just like I have described to you now, you know. So that's how I got into BUGAUP. And then I went into the history of BUGAUP. And I didn't even know the history of, well, how to say, it wasn't until years later. I just thought these guys are doing good at a public health level. And they mostly worked on smoking, but they also did some work on alcohol. And they were criticised for doing work on junk food. And some of them, particularly a group in England, looked at sexism in ads and women's objectifying women's bodies. And the BUGAUP stood for Billboard, Utilising, Graffitists Against Unhealthy Promotions, right? Not unhealthy products. So they were about advertising. And I knew that, but I hadn't recognised. And then it wasn't until years later that I found out that the origins of it. Bill Snow, who was a great activist, had written "Cancer" across the billboard early in the piece. And he'd been doing a billboard with another guy, a graphic artist called Rick Balzan. And then there was another guy who I think had been working with Rick, his name was Jeff Coleman. And Jeff Coleman was a lefty, and he'd been with a group called the Transnational Cooperative, which were looking at what the transnational corporations were doing in the 1980s. And that was funded by the union movement, actually. So he had a bit of a lefty political, and I thought, it's nothing to do with left-right politics. That's what I thought at the time. But the insight that Jeff had, which I think was critical, because the debate was framed of smokers and non-smokers. They've got different approaches. Some have chosen to smoke and some choose not to smoke, and they just have to not fight about it. You know, they have to be civil. We have to be civil to each other. So it was all about being civil, right? It wasn't about health. And of course, the idea that tobacco industry said is you've chosen to smoke. You're not addicted, of course. You choose. Every time you pick up a cigarette, you choose to have a cigarette. It's like I've chosen to have a lolly. You know, I'll have one now, thank you. I'll have an extra bit of chocolate because I like chocolate. You know, not I have to have it because the thing I didn't mention in nicotine is that it's addictive, of course. So as soon as your blood nicotine goes down to a certain level, you've reset all your nerves. So when your nicotine level goes down to a certain level, you feel the stimulus to have a smoke. And it relieves tension because the tension was caused by the withdrawal. So when the smokers say, it relieves my tension. Well, yes, it's what caused the tension, mate. Yeah.
Wearing tight shoes for the relief of taking them off.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's just kind of dumb, you know. So anyway, he said it's not smokers versus non-smokers and politeness versus impoliteness. It's an industry that is happy to make money by killing people and doesn't care, right? Doesn't care that it kills people as long as it gets the money. So it's about an industry killing people for money and paying the government to do nothing, right? Because effectively, and so in a sense, that guy who told me the tobacco company gave the New South Wales Liberal Party $250,000, so don't rock the ship. You know, that was exactly the point. Because I'd said to him at the time, he said they're giving $250,000, and I said, well, it's costing the Australian economy, I think it was 4.2 billion or whatever the figure was at the time, and he said, yes, Sonny, but that's our 250,000. So it might be costing the nation, you know, 4 billion or 5 billion or whatever it was, but our little bit of it. That's what's important, right? We don't give a stuff about. And I thought, well, Jesus, that's a mentality as well. If you're supposed to be a government looking after the people, and you're much more interested in your little bit of money than the whole national good, you know, you've got your values well out of whack, mate, you know.
When you were describing going into the different wards and seeing how much tobacco-related disease there was.
Tobacco caused,
sorry.
It's not that tobacco-related is another little euphemism that's gotten the fact that you could still be using it now says it all, really.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. My apologies. Tobacco caused disease. I mean, the amount of money that is on the back end of tobacco in the health industry must be astronomical in terms of the cost of getting people into hospital and out of hospital, and paying doctors like yourself to do surgeries. I mean, obviously there's the cost of tobacco and the taxes that the government receives, but the industry built around tobacco itself and its consequences must be, I mean, ungodly.
Well, I reckon it was at least a quarter of the cost of the entire health system. That was my estimate. And I think that was conservative. I mean, it might have been higher, but it might have been a third. But if you looked around, I mean, I used to do this sort of as once I started thinking about it, because most people don't think about it. You looked around the ward and you said, well, who's the sickest? And there'd be the smokers. And then you'd say, well, how many of them wouldn't be here if it wasn't for tobacco, right?
A good portion, wouldn't it?
It'd be a hell of a portion, right? And they were the sickest ones. So they weren't all equal, right? I mean, some people in ward are sicker than others and are going to require more effort than others. And if you went to intensive care units, 3/4 of them were smoking caused pathology. And they were, obviously, intensive care units eat up money much, much more than anywhere else, right? So if you looked, I just couldn't. And if you looked at the incurable cancers and the radiotherapy department and stuff, which are all highly expensive elements, I mean, I sometimes thought it must be half. Like it's massive. I mean, obviously everyone's going to die eventually, but some people, if you're 85 and you have a short illness and die, the death process is not necessarily a huge sickness process and not necessarily an expensive process, right? Whereas if you get cancer at 54 and you've got, endless amounts of treatment which end up not working, and then you go to palliative care and blah, 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 or you go to intensive care for ages, I mean,
costs a lot more, doesn't it?
Immense cost, yes. So, it was incredible to me that this was what was happening, and it seemed a monstrous misallocation of resources and a hell of a good investment for the tobacco industry, just giving 250,000 to the Liberals, you know what I mean? And I think they probably gave it to Labor at the same time. In fact, at the time that I joined the Australian Democrats, I joined them because they were the only political party. The Greens didn't really exist then. They were the only political party that didn't take money from the tobacco industry.
Wow. I mean, are the wards, I'm not sure how far removed you are from particular wards, but I mean, is this exactly the same as it is today, 2022?
Look, I haven't worked in a hospital ward for 10 years. Would you
assume that it would be?
No, there is less tobacco-caused disease than there used to be. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
There's less smoking than there used to be. There's less heart attacks. There's less chronic bronchitis. I think there's probably less amputations, although I don't have any figures for that. Interestingly, the figures haven't gone down in terms of the number of deaths caused, which I had assumed they would because I thought I'd done a great job for 20 years,
You did do a great job.
But I think they were very, very conservative in their definitions of what was a tobacco-caused disease. And I think now they've been a bit more thorough about the research on how much disease it causes. So the number of diseases hasn't dropped. But I think it's just because the definitions were tighter in those days. I think there is definitely less tobacco-caused disease than there was. And there has to be because there's less smoking than there was.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, obviously the price of cigarettes has gone up a lot. I mean, is the revenue that the government collects from cigarettes changed at all? Has it increased? Do you know?
I haven't been following it, but I can say with some pride that I'm partly responsible for the rise in cigarette prices.
How so?
In 1983, I went to my first tobacco conference, which was in Winnipeg, Canada. And I met a guy called William Weiss from Seattle, who'd done work on tobacco taxes and to price sensitivity. And he said, if you raise the price of cigarettes 10%, you get a 4% drop in consumption. So you've got extra revenue, right? But the other thing does, if you raise the price 10%, kids have less money. So that in fact, kid smoking drops by 12%, and 12% less kids get addicted because they don't get to a critical, like if they just do it to be naughty on weekends, they don't get addicted as much as if they can do it cheaply and do it every day, right? So that in fact less kids take up smoking. So you get a 25% drop in kid consumption if you get a 10% rise in prices. But because there's much more adults and their consumption only drops 4%, you end up with more revenue. So the higher the tax, the better the revenue, right? And also, so I wrote off to the minister, it didn't know no effect. So I wrote off to the cancer councils and they wrote off to the ministers. This all took a little time. And they said, oh, no, it's irrelevant now. You've got to write the submission at budget time. There's a certain time, it's a window of opportunity as the budget's being put together, and you have to write at that time. So took the cancer council, I did it for a little while, and they did it for a year, and that didn't do any good. And the second year, which was about 1985, I think, by the time the act was together. And they then convinced Treasury that you'll make more money if you put tobacco tax up, and no one will criticise you, right? So that was the start, because at that time, Australian tobacco tax was about 50% of the cost of packet cigarettes. The US price was about 35%, and the Danish were about 80%. They had the highest tobacco tax in the world, right? The Danes at that time. Australia was down near the bottom with the Americans. So I basically pushed, and people caught on. The health people caught on pretty quickly, and they were writing submissions to put the tax up, right? And so, yeah, now it's very high, right? You know, it's $20 for a pack of cigarettes, is it? What is something like that? Something?
Probably definitely more than that. Yeah, up towards $30, I would say.
Is it really? Well, see, they're really trying seriously to. I mean, people are more concerned about their money than their health, you know, because they think, oh well, yeah, I'll never get sick, but I sure as hell need that $20 in my pocket, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Is it a good idea to give these companies and the government more money for a problem they clearly don't care about? Surely there's other methods that we can explore, that people should be exploring to sort of deter people from using tobacco.
Well, you may not be aware of the history of all this.
No, I'm definitely not.
When we got rid of tobacco advertising, which was, I think, a Malcolm Fraser decision in 1976, I think. No, hang on. No, it wasn't. No, it was later than that. Well, it was much later than that. No, smoke-free buses, I think, was 76. No, there was still tobacco advertising in the mid-80s, till the mid-80s.
Yeah, well, I actually just opened up a my mum just gave me a bunch of old stuff from when she was a kid, just magazines and stuff like that, some Olympic stuff. And I opened up, I think it was a People magazine, 1986, front, inside of the front cover, pretty blonde girl, packet of cigarettes. And it was, I think it was 1986. So at least by then it was still in full fledged.
I mean, I was getting arrested for cigarettes in 1983 was when we did the public BUGAUP. We did a public refacing. We simply invited all the media, we invited all the tobacco companies, and we went and did a big billboard outside in Moore Park Road, which was just outside the Sydney Football Stadium, you know, near the showground there.
I think I saw the video, yeah.
Yeah, on a Saturday morning, just to prove and say, you know, arrest us if you will, right? That was I think that was the epitome of BUGAUP when we finally said we've won the propaganda war, everybody supports us, but you're going to arrest us in public at 10 o'clock, I think we started at 10 o'clock and finished by about 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning of the final, of the football final. We picked a time where nobody could say we didn't see you. And 5 police cars drove past. A number of people filmed us, and I think they were mostly stooges of the tobacco industry, right? Because we weren't on any channel except SBS. ABC was on strike that weekend. SBS covered us, and none of the commercials covered us. None of the commercial stations covered us at all, because they all had tobacco-sponsored events, you see.
Wow. Yeah.
And then Brian McBride took on Channel 10, did a thing called the Winfield Spectacular, because Winfield was sponsoring rugby league, and the rugby league were totally irresponsible. But as long as they got the money from Winfield, they didn't care less, right? They were totally irresponsible, I think, and the clubs and pubs were totally irresponsible as well. As long as they got the money, mate, they were going to lobby for their mates. And I mean, so the Winfield Spectacular, they had a whopping big flag Australian flag and a whopping big flag with Winfield Cup on it. And they had, in the middle of the oval, they had huge teams of people pulling these huge flags out, and they played the Winfield theme, which was something of Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, I can't remember which. And they played that, and these flags sort of rotated with all these 20 or 30 people on each flag pulling it into a big, and it was taken from a helicopter. So that this spectacular was on for TV. So we said this was a cigarette ad. It wasn't just a sponsorship, but this was not an accident, an incidental thing that happened, right? Because accidental or incidental was the escape words for the sponsorships, right? Now, we sued them. That was interesting. You can lay an information. If you think a crime's been committed, you can lay an information, and then it's heard in the magistrate's court, right? The cost of going to the magistrate's court was $13,000, right, for us, our legal costs. It was then taken up by the Department of Public Prosecutions, who then decided in the district court that it was a cigarette ad. Tobacco companies then appealed. No, Channel 10 it was. Channel 10 appealed and said that because this, in the proceedings, that the lawyer had held up a cigarette pack, this had prejudiced the jury's mind, and so they got the decision wrong because he'd actually distorted the evidence and distorted. Because he'd made the point that the Winfield flag and the Winfield cup were the same colour, and he did so by holding up a pack of cigarettes in the court. And this had confused the poor old jury's mind, and they had got it wrong. So the Supreme Court said, yes, it's bad evidence, you can't use it. So Channel 10 gets off, right? So the DPP then appealed to the High Court, right, to say this is ridiculous. Obviously, it's a cigarette ad, don't be so stupid. And the High Court ruled that, yes, it was a cigarette ad, right? Now, that whole process took about 4.5 years, right? And then Channel 10 was fined $10,000, which was less than it had cost us to lay the information 5 years before, right? That's what a farce it was. And that had 4.5 years where this thing was going through the courts, right?
$10,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and the cost of the prosecution was $1 million, right? Just for the legal costs. I mean, when you look at the insanity of the way resources are used and the legal system and how slow it is, I mean, you just despair. You can see why BUGAUP took their spray cans, I mean, because the political system and the legal system are just, well, they just don't work. You know what I mean? They're so slow as to be useless, and they're so conservative. It's very hard to get any proper change.
Let's just talk about BUGAUP specifically for a second. How many people were involved in the group when you were involved or when you joined?
We couldn't have a joining, as we couldn't have memberships, because that would then be part of a criminal conspiracy. And in fact, we were infiltrated by a guy who was a security guard, and it was really funny because, like we were all sort of young and pumped up, and we were mostly young, and pumped up and determined to do some good, right? And this guy came in who was a smoker, who was about 50, right, and had no apparent political commitment to anything. And he sort of came in, like, what the hell is he doing here,
Yeah.
And so some of them were a bit suspicious, and they'd say, we have to get that membership organised, that membership list organised. We need someone to organise the membership. They go, yes.
I've got it right here to sign.
Yeah, they like took the bait every time. And of course, there wasn't a membership list because there couldn't be a membership list but the concept from Jeff Coleman in the beginning was that once you had the name, and then they took a blank billboard and wrote the name there, and then put out a catalogue which said, Billboard Utilising Graffitists and why we were doing it and so on. So this was distributed around the universities, and of course the billboard itself. And then it was all pretty self-explanatory. As long as you signed it BUGAUP, everyone could see what you'd done. They could see why. Like you'd see an ad and you'd see someone taking the piss out of it, and you could see the word BUGAUP written on it. So that in fact you joined by doing, in a sense. You didn't have to go to an office and meet somebody and shake their hand or whatever. You did it. So there were people. It cropped up. There was a GP in up the North Coast used to do it. There was a guy in the town in Victoria used to do it. There was a ENT surgeon throat surgeon in Adelaide used to do it. There was a couple of guys, a renal doctor and virologist in Perth started doing it. There were various people. There was a whole bunch of medical students in Melbourne was doing it. In Sydney, there were a bunch of activists who were, I mean, we got about 100 people to the public demonstration in North Park Road just by ringing around. And not all of them sprayed. We did quite a lot of street theatre and stuff.
Yeah, I've seen some of that. Yeah, really interesting.
Melbourne were even better at the street theatre. They put a graveyard opposite the Australian Open Tennis, which was sponsored by Marlborough. They had a graveyard with 43 graves because their 43 deaths a day was the number. And they were all quite satiric, and they had people walking around in cigarette costumes and so on. And then they did the same sort of thing. They had the carcinogenic orchestra when the when the symphony orchestra was there. They all had their violins, and they had made out of
very clever
plywood violins, and and they were all dressed. The medical students were involved in that. They all had dinner suits, and they'd walk around handing out these leaflets, all very the orchestra's very upmarket. Everyone's dressed up in their finery. So they were all dressed up in their finery too, in their dinner suits, and handing out these leaflets while the Royal Carcinogenic Orchestra played. And they had recorded music there, and they said, "We're not having out the patrons or the thing. We're just having out the sponsors."
Yeah.
So that was happening. So there were a lot of people in Melbourne. They could get 30 or 40 people to get the demonstrations together. How many sprayed? I'm not sure. We had quite a few people arrested. The total number, as I say, we got about 100 people to the public refacing.
Was that the day that you were arrested, that very day?
No, they didn't arrest me that day. They had been arrested before that. I was arrested a couple of times. I was only charged once. I got arrested one other time.
What ended up happening with that conviction? Did you go to court and everything?
Well, I got convicted and I appealed, but they first of all charged us with malicious damage, you see, and so we said that we weren't being malicious. We were improving the situation, and we had very good intentions because we were trying to stop all the kids being hooked and this thing being reinforced. And so they were a bit worried that we'd get off on the malicious damage. So they charged me with willfully marking premises with paint. Now, it turns out that a premise is a structure fixed to the earth, a permanent structure fixed to the earth, right?
Okay.
But the paper on a billboard is temporary because it gets changed every 3 months. So that in fact, the paper on the billboard is not a premise; it's a temporary piece. So in fact, the prosecution found this and got me off and dropped the charge when it was on appeal, because of course they didn't like us being in court, because the judge, the barrister said to me, "You just say nothing and I'll get you off." And I said, No.
That's not going to happen.
No. I said, I haven't done this for you to get me off. I said, I've done this to get rid of tobacco advertising in Australia. He said, well, I don't think I want to take it. I said, look, if you don't want to do what you're told, I said, piss off and I'll get a different lawyer or not have a lawyer. I said, I am not going to shut up so that you can say you won the case. I said, this is not what it's all about, right? Oh, he said, is that how you feel about it? I said, yeah, you can take it or leave it, mate. So he took it, but then of course they dropped the charge. But from our point of view, the more you adjourned it, and you got more publicity every time it was coming up, right? And then you got interviewed more. So, from our point of view, you did it once and then you appealed, you adjourned and you buggerized around. And the police lady who'd been there when I got arrested, which was one Saturday night when I was silly enough, I'd gone out to a terrible dinner in a terrible restaurant. And as I was going home, I said to my girlfriend, I'll just do that billboard on the way home. But of course, Saturday night was a pretty dumb time to do it. Really. So
yeah.
But anyway, the police lady who was there, the whole thing had dragged on for about 18 months, right? We'd had all these appearances, and she'd gotten pregnant in the meantime. So there she was when I was going to court. She's about 5 minutes before delivery, and she waddles in, she said, if I ever see one of you blokes again, she said, I'm going to look the other way. She realised that the police were just the ham in the sandwich here, and she wasn't going to get involved again. And in a sense, that that was the way the police saw it in the end. They thought, look, this is a political campaign. We don't want to know,
And what was the response from the general public around that time? I assume that you would have had a bit of communication with just, average Joes and Janes.
I mean, we had immense support. I mean, there was the odd person who said, oh, it's a crime, it's property, where will it stop? Next thing you know, they'll be raping your grandmother, There's always these people who say, it'll expand to be very bad, But most people could see what we were doing. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. They could see that they were bullshitting. They could see that tobacco was causing. They could see that the government wasn't doing anything. I mean, people are not stupid, it wasn't a complicated issue. They could see the goodies were getting arrested and the baddies were telling lies. They could see that was the polarization. And Australia became the world's leading country on tobacco control, basically because everyone could say, and this is where I kind of got a lot of publicity, because I was the first to take BUGAUP to the world at the World Conference in 1983. And every other country in the world could say, well, they're getting arrested and put in jail in Australia, mate, to do something about tobacco. So what the hell are we doing over here? So everything they did, everything everybody else did became moderate because we were the extreme. You see what I mean? Once you define a pole, then the middle is halfway between the two. Before there was BUGAUP, the most extreme group was the Cancer Council. Well, the Cancer Council is never going to upset anybody because they want money for medical research and they want it from the conservative end of town because that's where most of the money is, right? The Cancer Council was never going to be radical, and the tobacco industry and the advertisers were going to rabbit on about freedom and commerce and not government non-interference and stuff. And so the middle point was doing nothing, right? Whereas once we were there, much more radical, the Cancer Council was in the middle saying, please do something. And they'd been saying that, but of course they don't want to offend anybody. But we'd done the offending. They didn't have to. So there was the odd person who said, oh, you can't do that, it's vandalism. And in fact, Rotary, who are a bit on the naive side, I think it was Rotary, it may have been Lions. Now, the outdoor advertising industry had a campaign saying, vandalism is a crime. And they had someone smashing a phone booth, and a woman standing there at the phone booth smashed, going, oh dear, I can't ring up, I'm in a crisis. So they had vandalism as a crime. They had a vandalism as a crime. But I mean, it was a pretty unsubtle message that, please get those graffiti people because, they're causing us a lot of embarrassment. And I think it was Rotary, a bit naive, saying, oh yeah, we revitalised, well, we'll put our name to it, right? Well, I think they were just a bit on the naive side. Really. They were thinking this was an anti-BUGAUP campaign. But I mean, most people could see that what we were doing wasn't really vandalism. I mean, smashing a phone booth when there's, well, that's the days before mobile phones, so people did
actually use them, yeah.
Had to use mobile phone, had to use, phone booths.
iPhones, yeah.
So
it was a different thing, obviously.
It was, well, the point was they were trying to put the two things together, right? Well, no one's fooled, Everyone knows what you're trying to say.
Did the group ever get contacted from the tobacco companies? Was there any direct communication between BUGAUP and the tobacco companies? And also, it sounds like the group had a big impact. Was there any tangible results of the group's behaviour on tobacco laws, on advertising laws? Was that a direct result of the work you guys were doing?
Well, we would say so, yes. I mean, we raised the issue from one of those ones where something ought to be done, but it never is, to when will the government do something? And I mean, if you take the first, basically, we were, because we made, if you look at the history of the anti-tobacco movements around the world, in America it was driven by non-smokers' rights. You go to a restaurant, I'm getting smoked, I'm exposed to smoke, I shouldn't be exposed to smoke, my civil rights being so I will sue somebody, right? So they were driven by the non-smokers' rights argument. In Australia, we said, and this was largely because of Jeff Coleman, his thing, look, it's the tobacco industry versus the world, right? That's what it's about, really. It's about an industry who's happy to kill people for money, right? So we had it far more focused on the evil the tobacco guys did, and advertising was the government allowing lies to be told to make the money. So in a sense, the argument we were having was a different argument to the main driving forces overseas. So advertising was the manifestation of the lie, if you like, and the evidence that the government wasn't doing it. So we had that slightly different approach, and so it was all about damaging the tobacco industry's credibility. Now, the West Australians had tried to get rid of tobacco advertising, and the sports lobby were well and truly bought out by sponsorship. And they ran this argument that there'll be no kids' sport if tobacco is taken away, right? And they got away with that. And the legislation in 1983 died. A bloke called Daydor, Tim, I think, his surname was Daydor. He was a liberal, I think, and he put it in, and then they gave him such a hard time, he left the party and put this bill in, and the bill was killed by the sports sponsorship lobby, which we just said they're bought lobbyists. You know, they've got easy money, and now they're happy to push tobacco just to get a few bucks, right? But the point was, so the Victorian Tobacco Act, which was in, I think, 1987, they fixed this point up. They said, well, if we raise the tobacco tax, because tobacco tax was at a state level, if we raise the tobacco tax, we'll buy out the sponsorships, we'll buy out the billboard advertisers, we'll buy out, because the tobacco industry was giving money to anybody who would support them. They were giving money to rescue. They had a rescue helicopter. They gave money to ethnic groups so that the ethnic groups would keep smoking. And of course, the ethnic groups were always saying, oh, we've got to integrate into a society, blah, blah. We've got to have our clubs and stuff. So there were anybody who would take money, was being given money by tobacco so that they could all lobby these people. If you stop them, they won't give us money. So effectively, if you want to give away money, you find you've got lots of friends. That's how life is.
Totally.
So the Victorian Tobacco Act increased the taxes, gave some to medical research, make the doctors happy, some to all these sponsored groups, particularly the football, because they were getting the most of it, but there was golf and you name it, it was getting sponsored. And then they wanted to have health promotion. So Australia became a world leader in health promotion, because the health promotion, which is really only advertising healthy things and behaviours, right? We became the world leaders on health promotion because there was more money in health promotion in Australia than there was in any other country. So all this was rolled into a bill that they would ban tobacco advertising and sponsorship, and they would put tax up, and the tax would fund all the groups that were losing the tobacco money. So that went through largely because of the efforts of Bugger Up and Mop Up in Melbourne, because the Victorians put it through first, the Victorian Tobacco Act in 1987. And Nigel Gray, who was the head of the Cancer Council in Victoria, and he was probably the most active, well, he was definitely the most active cancer council in Australia. The Victorian one was much more active than the others. And he was probably the godfather or the grandfather, or even to call it the figurehead of the medical profession who were actually doing something. And he said he was in despair at how little the medical profession overall would do, apart from saying the odd, putting out press releases and saying the odd thing. They didn't actually do anything. He worked with this Marge White, who was the main organiser of she was a middle-aged school teacher whose husband was a professor of virology, I think. And she was the organiser of the Melbourne activists. And he was delighted to sort of encourage her, and she was happy to, keep in touch with what was happening politically from him. And they all stood together on the night that the legislation passed. So, in fact, it was an endorsement. She stood with the health minister and Nigel Gray, the health establishment, if you want to put it that way, as the legislation, Victorian Tobacco Act, went through. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that the political will to take on the tobacco industry, the painting of the tobacco industry as an evil empire, was done on the streets by Bugger Up, really, and which both the visual effect and also the sort of moral effect of the court cases and so on really wedged them, really put the tobacco industry as, we're happy to kill people to make money, mate. And that made it very difficult. Because overcoming the amount of money they were giving the parties. See, then you've got to get the parties not to accept their money. And then, of course, even when you could get the companies, the political parties not to accept their money, they'd accept it from the Australian Hotels Association and the clubs, the Registered Clubs Association, and they were all funded. So when you say you're going to ban donations by a certain group, money has a way of getting around it.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
And that was the problem. So until we had an overwhelming public interest and response and support, they say that if you're going to overturn a lobby group, you don't even begin to make progress till you get to 85% of the population. Because until 85% of the population get the moneyed group will hang on. And I think that's right. I think that's probably the political and economic reality of what happens.
I wanted to ask, so we're talking about sort of the financials or the money that's generated behind tobacco and things of that nature. And I read yesterday, and I hope I'm wrong, but do these numbers sound right to you? The government receives $17.4 billion annually from tobacco taxes.
That sounds reasonable.
I mean, to consider that amount of money coming from tobacco just blew my mind. I couldn't believe it when I read it. And that's, as I said, annually. So that's per year. The deaths from tobacco, from what I've read, are about 20,500 people annually per year. Like, those numbers are just staggering. Do you think the government could do more? And if so, what could they do to prioritise the health of Australians over the money of Australians?
Well, I don't think it's a case of health versus money, because I think that the costs of the 20,000 deaths, not just the deaths, but the medical costs associated with all of that, is far greater than the 17 billion. So I would argue that there's a negative cost as well. It's not, you don't have health or money, you lose both health and money from tobacco. And so you basically got to get it down. Now, I think they haven't really had a serious quit campaign for maybe 15 years. I mean, basically they've been happy, as they've always been. I mean, the tobacco industry paid them, from 1950, right, was when smoking was shown to cause cancer, right? 1950. So they were basically paid to do nothing once it became a bit of a political issue, which was about 1960, when the Royal College of Physicians in England in 1961 said, I think 61 or 62, I think the report came out. And then the US Surgeon General report came out in 64. Well, by that time, the smoking control groups were starting to make demands. And so they were giving, the tobacco industry decided it wasn't going to stop its product. It was just going to tough it out, right, and buy inaction. And they basically just gave money to the political parties. And I think their quid pro quo was, we'll give you this money, say what you like, just don't make any legislative change or taxes or do anything. In other words, you can run things at schools because that doesn't have much effect. We can still get to the kids whether they've been to one of these courses or not. You know, it requires a lot of resources. You're not going to put much into it. So you can run education programs because it doesn't work very well. You know, since they're ineffective, you're allowed to do them, right? So they basically took the view, we'll buy your inactivity. And then when the Liberal guy said to me, you know, they give us $250,000, and I said it's costing $4.5 billion, and he said, yeah, but that's our $250,000. That's kind of the essence of it. They were being paid to do nothing, right? Now, I'm not convinced that they're not still getting monies somehow or other through, you know, like, you know, how the donations, only a third of them they can't even trace.
You think some of that potentially is from tobacco companies still to this day?
It's possible. And of course, it's going from pubs and clubs. Now, nothing in New South Wales, the government will never oppose the pubs and clubs. I mean, if you look at the gambling, the amount of harm gambling does, yet it's, of course, the pokies, and that's the pubs and clubs, and they will lobby to keep that no matter what, right? And so they will always, I mean, the Hotels Association line was, smokers drink more and gamble more than non-smokers, right? They're making bad lifestyle decisions, if you want to put it that way, but they give us more money per smoker that walks in the door to a non-smoker that walks through the door, right? All other things being equal. So they lobby for these behaviours and against anything that will restrict those behaviours. And I don't think we've had a decent quit campaign in Australia for at least 15 years. I couldn't tell you when the last one was, but there hasn't been one for a very long time.
Do you think there should be?
Of course.
And what do they look like? What should they look like?
Well, 99% of people who quit without help, right? So all the nonsense about vaping, you get a nicotine vaping machine and you substitute that for a cigarette. That's a tiny fraction. Most people say, I'm going to quit because, it's a silly thing to do and it's wasting my money, right? And so if you run quit campaigns at a mass level, I mean, the taxes are probably about as high as you're going to get them. You've got them pretty high already. I think they should stop vaping. Vaping is the new smoking, and they're working very hard to increase vaping.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that. We'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, at the moment, obviously you've got to enforce smoke-free laws. I think you've got to start putting a bit of pressure on the pubs because they've got these ridiculous definitions of smoke-free areas and smoking areas, with outdoors, how they've got, I don't know if you know how it is, but as long as
I do.
A certain percentage of the wall is permeable, they can call it outdoors even though it's indoors. So they want the smokers to be able to smoke with the pokies, because otherwise when the smokers go outside away from the pokies to have their cigarette, they might not go back in, you see.
They might have a moment of clarity.
They might have a moment of clarity. They might say, hey, the sun's out today, and hey, I'm running out of money, and hey, I might go home. Whereas they want them to keep staying at the machine with the machine feeding them stuff. So the smoking, so they want them to keep smoking so that they won't have a nicotine addiction crisis as they're gambling, you see. So that's why the pubs and clubs, when this came in, I tried to say there should be no poker machines in outdoor areas because, of course, they were trying to define where the poker machines as being outdoors because they had, good certain amount of percentage of ventilation. So they were trying to define the ventilation standard, and they got away with it. It came through Parliament when I was in Parliament, and I tried to say that poker machines should not be outdoors because that would have meant they couldn't put them in smoking areas, and that would have meant that the smokers would have had to go outside for a smoke, and that would have helped both the smoking problem and the pokey problem. And of course, the Hotels Association and the Clubs Association wanted those bodgy definitions of outdoors, and they wanted the poker machines in those outdoor areas, and they succeeded. And that was a good illustration of the power of those two lobbies, right? Or that lobby. It's the same lobby, two different groups within it, But this is all. I mean, if you look at the pubs, they're all I'm sure they're subsidised by tobacco.
Yeah, it's almost insurmountable to go when. Of all the things that people argue about, in terms of politics and the government, and is this right, is that right? When you talk about gambling, alcohol and tobacco, and you talk about some of the things that you've just mentioned, how can this government be considered to be doing the honourable thing when they're allowing these shady rules to get passed and they just clearly do not care about any of these problems? I mean, it's glaring when you look into it even for 15, 20 minutes. It's really quite amazing. Looking into, this issue for the past couple of days in preparation to speak with you has really just blown my mind as to how much, as you said before, inactivity from the government and how much they appreciate that money from, tobacco and tobacco-caused disease and areas where you can smoke. It's amazing. I mean, is it surprising to you? Is this something normal to you that you've just become accustomed to over your career?
Well, I mean, I thought it through over the tobacco issue, right? That we should have preventive social policies, that you can't tell someone what to do, but you can create an environment which renders a certain behaviour more likely and a certain behaviour less likely, right? So the tobacco industry will do everything it possibly can to make you take up smoking, right? And so the government should try and counteract that and say, well, let's make an environment where people don't smoke. I think they should make an environment where people don't drink, or if they do, they drink very little. I think they should make an environment where people don't gamble. I think they should make an environment where everybody learns to swim. You know what I mean? I think they should make an environment where every kid is valued, and an environment where there are good role models for how to behave. You know what I mean? If you say in schools, I mean, if you said, say, I mean, my model of preventive social policy, as I call it, and perhaps preventive is bad because it's sort of a negative word, but you know, it would be really cheap to subsidise childcare so that every child had good childcare, so that all the kids who've got problems with their parents are drug addicted or whatever, get really good childcare, so they have some model of a stable society where people do the right thing and you get looked after and you get well fed and everything like that. Now, the cost of that in the relative scale of everything would be bugger all.
It would be a fraction of the taxes received annually, wouldn't it?
A fraction. And if you look at, say, you know, the cost of kids, the amount of money you spend bringing up a kid, the just cost of the childcare is nothing, really. And I mean, why is school free from, you know, the age of 6 or on and not free below 6? You know, why do we say, and why don't we say, well, look, let's just make it means tested so only poor people get it? Well, that's fine. They're the people that need it, right? If you don't need it, well, you know, if you want to keep the taxes down, you can have it universal. I don't have a problem with that because we pay the tax and then we get it back, right? And the people who don't have kids subsidise those who do have kids. But society as a whole wants to keep going, and it has to reproduce. And only at a certain point in time, only a certain number of people are reproducing, and the others are either don't want to or are, you know, older and don't need to. You know what I mean? So, you know, it's a question of having the common good. I mean, gambling. If you said to somebody, well, we want to encourage people to make really bad financial decisions to get them into a jam, right? And then, of course, the consequences of that on their own lives, on their kids' lives and everything else are far, far greater than the money wasted. So you would say it's very good social policy to have as little gambling as possible. Now, if you ban it, of course, you'll have illegal casinos and blah, blah, blah. But why would you approve Star Casino building a huge casino? Why would you approve that? You know, when you had... I mean, the registered clubs, I think, have been quite irresponsible. I mean, the idea that they are good. I mean, in a sense, they do produce slightly cheaper food because it's subsidised, you know, by the pokies But overall, poker machines and gambling, it's like if you had an ad on TV that said, "Please don't invest wisely. Please invest in something. Please waste your money and then go on welfare. Please waste money that you need for rent. You know, please give yourself problems." It's like, you can't have an ad like that.
Yeah, there's somewhere where you can go to do exactly that.
This whole idea, and, you know, I mean the bet thing, you know, you can't just watch a football game now. You've got to bet with your mates. So this is all, you know, getting a subculture where I don't just go to football. I bet with my mates and I spend some money on gambling as well. You know, and then you say bet responsibly at the end of it. You know, like they said, smoking is a health hazard at the end of it, because they knew perfectly well you weren't going to, right? They're getting you in there, right? So, you know, if you have social policy that's sensible, just to sort of minimise harm, that's what the government ought to be doing. But basically, they're being paid by lobbyists not to do that. They're being paid by lobbyists to let the market, which means the people with money, basically, say and do what they like, and that we then all pay for. It's government sort of shrinking into itself. If you want to do bad and you're making a buck from it, you're allowed. If the government wants to do good, you mustn't do that. That's Big Brother. It's nanny state, whatever you want to call it. You know.
Have you considered? I mean, these tobacco companies. I mean, you name British American Tobacco, Philip Morris, Rothmans, Altria, all these giant companies, they're all run by people, obviously. There's people that work for them, there's people involved. And these government people, forgive my ignorance, probably not a good term not the right term to use, but there's people that are involved that we're speaking about. Have you ever considered how they might feel? I mean, what would they do if you sat them down and they clearly know the facts? It seems to me like they would have trouble sleeping at night when they understand what these problems are. How do they go about their daily lives being involved in such a horrific business? I mean, have you ever come into contact with any of these people and sat down and chatted with them?
I always remember the words of Nick Greiner. Nick Greiner was a leader of the opposition when I was a young Liberal trying to get a ban on tobacco advertising through the conference of the Young Liberals in Melbourne in about 1981. He was there. Jeff Kennett was an advertising man. He was the Premier of Victoria at the time. Nick Greiner was the leader of the opposition in New South Wales. They were meeting at that conference. I went and approached them and said, look, this something needs to be done. They treated me with huge rudeness and disdain and said, piss off, basically. And then Nick Greiner became Premier of New South Wales, and then he obstructed the Health Minister, who was Peter Collins, in terms of things that Collins wanted to do. And then he left Parliament and became the head of British American Tobacco. And he was challenged at one time to explain what he was doing. And he sort of said, oh, well, we're all a bit of hypocrites sometimes, but, life goes on. So in a sense, that answer was, well, we're only little sinners. We're not really doing anything. Everybody knows tobacco's harmful. So since they know already, we're only dealing with people who have decided they want to take the risk. So it was a complete transfer of responsibility from the guy selling to the guy buying, right? The fact that the tobacco companies were busting a gut to market it, and that he was very powerful in the Liberal Party still, because of course he had been ex-Premier and had a lot of, was seen as a wonderful Premier who was, pushed out of office. So he was in an ideal position to lobby for tobacco within the Liberal Party, which of course is more than half the political system in Australia. And he was there lobbying for them, saying, oh, well, we're all a bit hypocrites. We also do what we have to do, like they dissociate themselves from. I mean, I had another guy who was, I met through the sailing club, and he was a tobacco executive, and I had clashed with him, basically he was there, really. And his wife said, look, he wasn't very well educated. He could never get as good a job as this in another industry. He's doing really well and we're doing really well, thanks to the fact that he's in tobacco marketing, here. So, there was and I think the people who market, the more evil their product is, the more they're paid, because, they want the best marketers. And so people work marketing tobacco are making more money probably than they would marketing. Well, if you were marketing,
shoes or something,
famine aid in Africa or something, you're not going to be paid very much, right? Because the people who are running the famine aid are going to give as much money as they can to the famine, aren't they? They're not going to give it to the PR company. So, obviously that's, whereas in tobacco, where there's practically no merit in the product, they're going to have to put a lot of effort into getting. So in a sense, there's a huge financial incentive, I think, for the people involved. And then there's lots of rationalizations. They spend their whole life. I mean, the thing that we were up against, and I mean, when you said, you asked, did Dr Arthur talk to the tobacco industry? Well, not directly, but we were often, I was often on TV in debates, and they'd bring in the tobacco industry and we would debate them, right? And they would say, oh, you. And eventually they stopped the debates because they were losing. We were the high guys and they were the murderers. And eventually the commentators would give them a hard time, right? And they would get no traction from the idea that, oh, it doesn't really matter. Oh, it's a free country. Oh, it's a free product. Oh, the government shouldn't be interfering, Eventually those lame arguments were sort of dismissed by the, admittedly, at first we had to argue against them, and then later the commentators all came on board and they would say, yeah, but you can't, you've got to admit it's killing people, don't you? And you've got to admit you're selling it, don't you? And there weren't really any answers to that. Yes, we're selling it even though it kills them. What else can they say?
There's nothing to say, yeah.
So in the end, they were better to say nothing, right? And so then there wouldn't be a debate, and they could simply keep on going in the back rooms, if you like, make sure nothing happened at a political level. And so that's how it evolved, I guess.
And that's kind of where we're at the moment in terms of tobacco use, aren't we? Because it's largely invisible. Obviously, there's no advertising anymore. I mean, movies, you see smokers, and obviously you see people smoking, but there's I mean, some people might not even know the names of these companies. Does that make it harder to fight the problem now that they've gone away completely? I mean, you can't even, when you walk into a shop anymore, the cigarettes are hidden behind a counter, and the problem's kind of hidden behind closed doors. Do you think that makes it harder for people to realize how much of an impact it's still making?
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, I think even people like myself, I mean, I live in a reasonably comfortable suburb. I mean, I could walk around here. I'd be lucky to see a smoker anywhere I go.
Mm.
If I were in marketing or in the building industry or in the western suburbs or in ethnic groups, I'd see that. But I mean, as a sort of white middle class male, I don't see much of that. And of course, as you say, the companies aren't advertising; they're invisible. There's still a lot of problem out there, and the government has always, even when they were doing nothing in the 1970s and 80s, said, "Oh, we've made huge progress, we've made huge strides. You know, everybody knows it's true, blah blah blah, and therefore we have to do nothing." And now they're saying, "Oh, they're saying exactly the same thing. You know, nothing's changed." Oh, well, you know, there's no real problem. We've made huge strides. You know, the fact that, as you say, it's still $17 billion worth of tax and 20,000 deaths, that's roughly the same number of deaths there were then. I mean, I think the counting of them's changed a little, but it's still large numbers. It's still the disadvantaged people much more than it was. I mean, as I say, living in a good suburb here, I don't see much. You know, there's not in the upper levels of society, if you want to put it that bluntly. There's not much smoking, but in the poorer areas, there is. They're the least able to afford it, as they're least able to afford gambling. You know, and the government's quite happy to say, you know, it's not visible to the class of people who might be active, which is the sort of the upper middle class are the political drivers of society, if you know what I mean. If it's an issue, and the poor people, you know, are so busy living, and they assume that they've got no political power, which once you make that assumption, it becomes true, right? So yeah, I mean, you're right. You're quite right to raise it, and I'm probably bad in the sense that I've gone off the boil for the last 20 years. You know.
Well, I think you've done more than most.
The last 20 years, I haven't done anything on tobacco for 20 years, really, and I bloody well should have, really. But I mean, I suppose even my patients, I mean, I try and get them off. I'm still seeing patients as a doctor. I try and get them off, and I'm still a little shocked to find they're smoking. But when I ask, because they don't come in smoking, you don't smell of smoking, they don't usually have packets in their top pockets like they used to. But if I say, how many do you smoke? Oh, 20 a day. Go, what? You know, it's still happening.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, you're right in the sense what you're saying is it's gone underground, or it's not getting attention anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And I think initially that is a good thing, but I feel like they're sort of capitalizing on that a little bit.
Oh yeah, the industry is capitalizing, and the politicians are. Well, they've always capitalized. It's all done. We don't have to do anything, right? Just keep the money coming, troops. You know.
What do you suggest to your clients that are smoking? Do you say anything to them? Do you pressure them to give up? Do you give them any reading material, or do you get them to watch your Confessions of a Simple Surgeon?
I get them to watch my video. I say, "You've been out of date, mate, but have a look."
The great short documentary, by the way. I watched it this morning. Yeah, really well done. I mean, is there anything that you suggest to them in particular? Is there like a protocol for that type of thing?
You know, it sounds ridiculous, but I've never really run individual quit campaigns. I've always been interested in getting the whole country to quit. You know what I mean? I've always felt that
big picture.
Yeah, 1-to-1 is very labor intensive, but I do try and relate it to them if I can. I mean, if I'm approaching someone, if I say, "Oh, you've got a rough voice, have you been smoking?" Or, "Gee, your skin's a bit waxy, do you smoke?" And if you can relate it to their personal health, that has much more impact than any figures about, you know, you might get lung cancer in 20 years or something, because everyone thinks that won't happen to them, you know. And so I do try to relate it to them, and I certainly tell them that, you know, it's not doing them any good. Even if I can't find anything immediately wrong with them, I ask them, and then I tell them to look at my video and come back, you know. So I try, but I mean, I suppose, as every doctor discovered for years, you could do a hell of a lot of counselling, a hell of a lot of talk without it making a huge difference. People, they'll tell you, I cut down a bit, is what they tell you. But I think they're sometimes telling you what they think you want to hear.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? You've got to want to help yourself for someone to help you. I did just want to mention, I did mention it on the phone, and for anyone listening or for anyone that's going to listen, obviously I'm not a doctor or an expert by any stretch of any imagination, but there is a book, which I think you said you weren't aware of, called Alan Carr's Easy Way to Quit Smoking. I just wanted to note, obviously we've been talking about tobacco and things like that. I can't recommend this book enough for anyone that's entertaining the idea of quitting smoking. It's available as an audio book as well. And it's a famous book. I'm sure many people listening to this would have heard of it. But I cannot recommend it enough for a quit smoking aid. It's probably not what you think it might be when someone says, read this book, it might help you quit smoking. But yeah, I just wanted to say that if anyone's listening, thinking about quitting smoking or has someone in their life that's smoking that they want to learn more about this, an excellent book, really amazing, really good information. And yeah, again, probably not what you would think it might be.
I'll put in a plug for my video. It's out of date to hell now, but it's it still tells the story. Confessions of a Simple Surgeon, and it's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's really good. How much, I wanted to ask you about that. How much attention did that get you when it was released? Was it released through any major networks or anything like that?
Oh,
was it hidden in the catacombs?
What happened was, I was giving slideshows on BUGAUP at the time, and I gave one at TAFE to some apprentices, and the guy up the back was from the audio-visual unit of TAFE. He was a filmmaker, a very good filmmaker actually, but he just wanted a salaried job because he had kids, and that's why he was working for TAFE. And he said, I can make a video of this. And I said, no, whatever you like, that's fine. So he said, look, I'll interview you. He said, when you answer the questions that I give you, answer as if the answer encompasses the question. In other words, you make a series of statements. You don't,
Gotcha, yeah.
So then he strung all the statements, and he said, I'll ask you the questions several times, and then we'll see which is the best answer you give and use that. So he asked me a whole lot of questions about BUGAUP, and I answered the questions. And then he strung all my answers. He took the shortest answer and strung together a script, which was kind of a story of how I got into the anti-tobacco movement and what I'd done and what BUGAUP had done and so on. And he made this video for TAFE, right, for the TAFE students. Now, he made this video and he wanted the minister to launch it. And the Minister for Health was Peter Collins, I think, and he wasn't game to launch it. So he got the Minister for Education, which was Terry Metherell, who was a fairly controversial figure, but, something of a maverick at that time. He was the Liberal minister. So he launched this video in a ceremony in TAFE, and we had morning tea together. So anyway, nothing then happened to the video. TAFE presumably showed it to their people, and then TAFE decided it had to get in the market, and it had to market this video. And it had been sitting there for 7 months, and they didn't quite know what to do with it. I said, well, can I buy a copy? Oh, well, TAFE can't sell. We don't have the ability to sell anything, right? So along came management and said, well, we'll have to set up a marketing thing, and then we can start to sell the video. Right? So meanwhile, Paul said, look, this video is going nowhere. I'll enter it in some film festivals. So it won in New York. It won in Chicago. It got an award from the British Medical Association. It got 5 Atom Awards, the Australian Teachers of Media, which they made it after that. They made it you can only enter it in one category because
you won so many.
It won 5 out of 8 categories, you see, and so
it should, yeah.
Well, it did. So anyway, it won all these, and then finally it won enough film festival awards to get an Oscar nomination.
Wow!
But it has to get them within a 12-month period. The first 7 months, it was sitting in the cupboard in TAFE. So it actually won all the points in 5 months. But in fact, when it got enough points to get to an Oscar nomination was a year and 4 days from when we'd have the tea and bickies in TAFE. So it was ineligible to get the Oscar nomination, actually.
Oh, no.
So
Incredible.
it was a bit ironic. And then there was a bit of a mix-up with fax numbers, and I was invited to go to Walnut Creek, California, to the Medical Film Festival when it was being launched there, which it won as well. And I had an exam that day. I was doing my occupational medicine and I couldn't go, which is a bit of a shame because maybe I could have been a film star in America, but it never happened. The medical film festival, I wasn't there, and B, the Oscar nomination fell over. So, I mean, it did very well, but it could have done. But it was on, and then it was on TV 3 times, and they couldn't put it on more because there were 2 actors. If you look, there's a little period where there's a cigarette ad in the middle, and there are 2 actors, and the actor agent said, "Oh no, we want to all renegotiate the money if they're." And eventually we got to the actors and they said, "Jesus, we'd have done it for free. Well, it's ridiculous. We wanted as much publicity as you did, But by that time, the opportunities had gone. But the film could have done better if, there'd been various other things. And then TAFE, when it went marketing, gave it to some tiny little group in Edinburgh to market it. And one of the guys who was involved in making it went and got it that it would go in every school in England. The guy in Edinburgh said, no, you can't do that. I want my cut. And the whole thing fell over.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then the Americans were marketing it. Like when they were going to price it, I said, well, look, a video in the video store is $25, right? So it should be marketed for $25. And they said, because it's got to compete with every other video in the shop, right? To get people to buy it. Oh, no. The price of educational videos varies from $70 to $350. And I thought, that's ridiculous. I said, no one's going to buy it for $350 or even $70. So the price was halfway between what I wanted, which was $25, and what they said was the minimum price for an educational video, which was $70. So the price of it was $45 in Australia, right? Which was much higher than anyone was actually going to pay, or at least I wanted John and Susan Average to buy it, right? I didn't want the education people to buy it. So it had this funny price, and they were marketing it. And then they decided they'd market it. They gave the world rights to some distributor who put $325 on it, right? So it was selling in America for $325. It was selling in Australia for $45, right? It was insane.
Mm.
So,
and this is for one copy of, I'm assuming, like a VHS tape?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. One copy of VHS tape.
That's expensive.
New Zealand. I went to New Zealand, and this is a funny story. I went to New Zealand, and Helen Clark was the health minister at the time. She later became prime minister.
Wow, yeah.
And she was a good, gutsy lady, and still is. She's now head of, she became head of the UN development. She went from prime minister of New Zealand to the UN. She was a gutsy lady. She was health minister at the time. She wanted to bring in Smoke-Free Environment Act over there, and the health groups wanted to run confessions through the whole country, right? And so I rang up TAFE and said, what are you going to do about this? And they said, don't you do anything. We'll get our marketing together. We've just got to get the legal aspects. So I rang them up 6 months later. When are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this? Oh, yeah, don't you do anything. We're going to do the marketing. Well, I said to the Cancer Council over there, for Christ's sake, don't worry, but just copy the bloody thing and do it, right? So they copied it, and there were thousands of copies everywhere, right? So and TAFE blamed me for it, which they could have done. I mean, they said, there's been gross breach of copyright. We were going to market it ourselves in New Zealand, and now there's no market. And I said, well, bloody fool for doing nothing for 18 months,
Yeah, you weren't doing it, yeah.
You weren't doing anything, and now, we've got the legislation through, which was the objective. Now, you might think the objective is to maximise the profit of your sales of this video, but in fact, this video wasn't made to make a profit for TAFE, right? This video was made to get a result. And it did. I think it was part of the Smoke-Free Environment Act. Mind you had a health minister who was willing to do something over there. And New Zealand is trying to make the country smoke-free completely by 2025. Like they are.
Wow.
They've got their bit, they are working on finishing the job, right? And, we over here, we're doing pretty well nothing.
Yeah, I didn't know that. How do they plan on doing that? I mean, it's not vaping, is it? It's an actual realistic approach?
They're against vaping, but well, they've still got vaping stores over there. The industry's been very conscientious trying to get vaping up in New Zealand. And I'm not quite sure, I haven't been in New Zealand for some time, but certainly they have got, and I haven't followed the chapter and verse of it, as I say, I'm getting a bit off the pace really, but they have got an objective, a stated objective to get tobacco consumption down to zip by 2025. I don't think they'll succeed, but if they can get it as a sort of marginal activity that silly people do, that would be a major public health benefit, I think. And the
Definitely.
fact that we haven't is very significant. I mean, we've got New Zealanders giving us, a good example. They're only across the ditch, Why the hell isn't our government doing the same? And I think the answer is because the lobbies are still working.
It's true. I guess more people need to speak up, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I know what the solutions are, but I definitely think there's a gap for some sort of solution. Let's talk about vaping. Do you recognize similarities in the vaping pandemic to the initial stages of the popularity of smoking in Australia? Is there any similarities between the two? Because I've just seen an explosion of vaping. I just seem to see it everywhere now. And the demographics are a lot different. I find obviously it's marketed towards younger people, even though it's not marketed. I guess it's the product itself lends itself to younger people, which is a bit of a worry. But what are your thoughts on the whole vaping thing?
I think it's the same characters doing the same things as they did before. I mean, it's done by the same people. I mean, Altria, I think, which was Philip Morris, has changed its name. Philip Morris changed its name to Altria, which has the wonderful word altruistic in it.
Very true.
Sounds,
wow.
It's a variant of altruistic, right? Which is about as far from what they do as could be found.
Yeah.
But irony is not found in this area. They have bought out Juul, which I think was the biggest vaping technology and most successful vaping company. So in fact, the tobacco industry is getting in there. They want to put the nicotine in there. And I think some of the medical people, not in Australia particularly, and Greg Hunt's been quite good on this, the Federal Health Minister, but there's some idiots in the anti-tobacco world who think of vaping as being an alternative to smoking and a good way of quitting, right?
Mm.
Now, when I was in the serious anti-tobacco movement, we had conferences every year, and I'd go there and stay in the cheapest hotel I could find and pay my own way and stuff. And the activists would be paid. The activists would pay their own way. The health bureaucrats would have 3-star hotels, and the doyens at the top would have slightly better hotels, and we would do our conferences. And parallel to that, there was the conferences that were much better funded by the industry, which was the quit industry, which basically was selling nicotine replacement products. Now, the number of people who quit using nicotine replacement products is a tiny fraction of the people who quit. 99% of the people who quit because they decided they would one day. And
I've heard that, yeah, the replacements are basically ineffective.
Well, that's the success rates. I mean, if you talk, they can always find one case that did really well, right? But generally,
yeah,
it's a trivial number, right? And if you look at the amount of money that went into that because of the medicalization of you need the nicotine substitute. It's a drug. We have to get doctors. You have to have this medical model that, the doctor will supervise your quit with a withdrawal program, blah, blah, blah. It's a trivial stuff, right? In public health terms. And yet some doctors that's their specialty will then say, well, this is my specialty, so it's frightfully important, right? And so they see the whole world through the prism of what percentage of my quit patients quit, right? Well, the number of people who go to a quit clinic at all is negligible, right? And then if you look at the percentages of that, you're talking tiny fractions in numbers. But they then said, oh, well, vaping will help the nicotine delivery. It'll be in social, blah, 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 so it's better. So they, in effect, allowed vaping to occur. If you looked at, what went wrong with tobacco, they didn't have to prove it was healthy. The doctors had to prove it was unhealthy. And then they resisted every proof all the way along the line. Hence the term smoking-related disease, because the doctors made a statistical association, which was a relationship, not a cause. And so they grabbed that word related and said, oh, related doesn't mean caused. And they're hanging on to that to this day. And so, of course, when a few doctors said, oh, vaping's better than smoking, instead of saying you have to prove it's safe, they went back to the previous position, which is the mistake we made with tobacco. You have to prove it's harmful. So that effectively means they can do it and get millions and millions of people to do it. And then until someone proves it's harmful, there'll be no force to stop it. And then when there is a force to stop it, they'll resist that force for another 20 or 50 years, you know? So effectively, instead of, like, if you had a food and said, I've got a new food I've just invented, right? You'd have to prove it was safe. You'd have to poison, you know, thousands of mice and thousands of guinea pigs and stuff and say, look, this stuff's safe for humans, right? But with vaping, they got out of that. Once again, they're saying it's harmless and it's going to take the medical profession, you know, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, to prove it's harmful, if it is, which it's likely that it is, right?
I can't see how it is.
I can't see how it's good for you, right?
Exactly, yeah.
It's solvents, right? Now, as solvents dissolve things, right? So if you sniff petrol, you dissolve your cell walls and your brain goes, you know? Now, you've got a solvent that you're inhaling. It must be, if it goes into the lungs, it's probably soluble in fat. If it's soluble in fat, it'll dissolve fat. If it'll dissolve fat, it'll dissolve your brain eventually, right? It's difficult to believe that it won't do you harm. Now, whether you put flavors in it or whether you don't, and then whether you want to analyze whether every flavor has its own harmful effect or not. If you said, is it likely at some point to be shown to be some way harmful? The answer is likely to be yes. So if you were taking the precautionary principle that do no harm, you'd say, look, let them prove it's healthy. You know, let them prove. Don't say, no, well, you know, you just go ahead, mate, and we'll figure out, you know, we'll pick up the tab for anybody killed, damaged, whatever, in 20 years' time. You know, you go for it now, make your profits now, mate, and, you know, the public will pick it up. The doctors will do all the research. You know, I mean, it's an insane way of going about it, really. But the difference, so in a way, the economic drivers are the same, the propaganda is the same, but in a way, the marketing's been very different. See, someone like myself, you know, middle-aged, middle-class, civilized suburb, blah, 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 we don't see much vaping here. I don't see vaping, right? You're saying there's an epidemic of vaping. To be honest, I've hardly noticed it. I see people vaping occasionally because I'm in a different subculture, you know, and they can market to people on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or whatever. I don't see it. It's not in my feed. You know what I mean? My feed doesn't get any of that. And they can market much more selectively than they ever could before, right? When the billboards were there, we could say, hey, those kids are going to see those billboards. We'll go spray them, right? Now, much more subtle.
Yeah, much more
segmented. So they're getting away with murder, I reckon. And no one can explain how come there's this explosion of vaping. Well, it ain't an accident. It's a campaign.
Yeah, and you see these tobacco companies are shifting into the market, obviously, and I guess they're just trying to maintain control over the market and keep the money coming in. And they're toting it with things like, you know, smoke-free alternatives and health. You know, they're sort of going down the road that they're going to provide some sort of benefit to people's health. But these companies have never done that in the past. It's really, really shady what I think's happening. And I'm interested to see where it goes because, I mean, I guess if the government remains inactive, it'll just be the next problem that we have.
Well, that's how I see it. The industry will profit maximize. At the moment, they're saying it's better than tobacco, therefore it's good for health, which, of course, that's not the benchmark of what's healthy. Hello?
No, it's not.
So they will say whatever they have to say to get their marketing done. They don't really give stuff, right? Marketers, liars for hire, as far as I'm concerned. That's Bugger Up's position, you know. Marketers, liars for hire, you know. And they will keep marketing it. And the government doesn't have to do anything. They mainly want the government to do nothing because they're the only force that can stop it, right? The government is pretty much the only force that's got the power to stop these industries. And so as long as they can make the government do nothing, that's good enough.
It's a worry. In that Confessions of a simple surgeon. There's a scene with you. You're standing on a set of stairs, and you've got some lungs in your hand. It's towards the end of the film.
Yeah.
It's really confronting for someone like me who, obviously I don't see that type of thing every day. But I wanted to ask, in the medical profession, did you have to get used to that type of thing, performing surgeries? Is your stomach strong naturally, or do surgeons have to deal with that the same way anyone else would, cutting people open and seeing those types of things? Is that something you have to get used to, or do most surgeons have a natural ability to sort of deal with gruesome things like that?
No, the first time I went into theatre, I felt giddy and had to sit down when the blood started squirting out.
Yeah.
But I mean, you
would have seen a lot of it, though.
Well, you do it the first couple of times. That's your reaction, because that's sort of what happens. If you go to a car accident and you've never seen it before,
yeah,
you have that sort of reaction. But you just say, well, hang on, I've got to get used to this, and and it goes away.
Yeah, right. Okay.
You just get immune to that sort of human initial reaction, I guess you'd say, and it's just you try and see things very much in practical terms. What am I going to do? What's the objective here? Of course it's going to bleed. We'll just get rid of the bleeders and keep going. That's so in a way. I mean, the lung thing was we wanted to go and confront the tobacco industry they were down in a building in Circular Quay, actually. We went down there and confronted them.
Do you think they're still there?
Well, I haven't followed it. The Tobacco Institute, as it was called, Tobacco Institute, get that like some sort of hugely educative body, was just a sordid little lobby, right? But I think that was abolished and the companies all did it themselves. But at that time, that was their lobby group, and it was their public front, if you want to call it that way. I think after that, they decided,
I don't think they have a public.
We don't want to make
anymore.
any public statements. We'll work behind the scenes. Thank you very much. And that all died. I couldn't give you which years that happened.
Yeah, I guess there would still be people in offices somewhere, but I imagine they would be nondescript, office space. They wouldn't want to highlight their location. I would assume.
No. They take a very, very low public profile. I mean, a lot of them, say the Defence Department's the same. It sells weapons. You don't see big offices and big things. They just quietly do it behind the scenes.
Quietly rake in the billions. I wanted to ask, aside from tobacco, which is obviously was a big part of your early medical life in terms of patients that you saw and the types of things that you would see, has there been any other notable changes in the medical or in the health industry since you became a doctor? That sort of, it's a very open-ended question, but has there been any? I mean, has the pandemic been something that's impacted your medical life, or has there been any other major changes since you became a doctor up until now? Still practicing?
There's been some technological advances. There's been a lot of advances in treatments. I mean, one of the other campaigns that I was sort of involved in was supplementing thiamine deficiency.
Okay.
Vitamin B1, which of course
that red meat.
Red meat's got it in, yeah, but deficiency was common in alcoholics, and they got neuropathies and so on, and then they memory loss, and as well as liver failure, all comes from vitamin B1 deficiency. That was quite common, and that was supplemented in about 1985. It was put in bread, and basically that killed the problem of vitamin B1 deficiency.
Interesting.
I wasn't ever involved in the campaign, but the doctors were involved in that. They wanted to put it in beer because it was so common in alcoholics, but the alcohol industry didn't want that in there. And some of the health promotion people said, no, they'll say that beer is a health food if you do that. Yeah. So eventually they put it in bread because most people eat bread. But some of the other things, I suppose, the drugs that stop gastric bleeding and gastric ulcers are very important, because we used to lose a few people with that.
Yeah. I guess there's probably been a lot of things. I mean, I guess there's things every year that change in the health industry and in the medical world.
Well, there are a lot of advances in the cancer treatments with chemotherapy and stuff that are big. I mean, I'm not involved in that area. Like I know there's always cancers, and I know there's always been chemo, and I know their success rate has increased considerably, but in the sense that I don't work in it and I don't even chase the statistics. I know that it's happening, but I'm not there. I mean, I suppose I've become interested in preventive social policy and the origins of power, and I think to myself, well, I've got, 20 years of life left. What am I going to spend it on, or what should I be doing, And I must admit, I've been thinking in terms of global politics now, and I think the Anglo democracies, Australia, the US, and Britain, have fairly primitive democracy models. I mean, the English were the first to get rid of the king and put the king in, as a figurehead, and then have democracies. But the democracies we have are fairly primitive. And then, of course, the Americans got a democracy, a bit before us, 1769 or whenever it was it? Something like that. Anyway, the point, our constitution was modelled on theirs, right? Now, they have two houses of parliament, and then, of course, they invented political parties. And so it's a binary system. You've got two parties. When one wins, they get all the power, pretty much. So they get 40% of the vote. That gives them 51% of the seats. That gives them 100% of the power, right? And then they do what they like until they're thrown out, right? Now, that's pretty primitive. If you take the constitution of, say, Germany, which was written by Churchill, he said, we don't want one party ever able to be all the power. We want them to have to negotiate with other parties so that there's discussion, right? Now, Churchill set that up for Germany, right, after the Second World War. But that's a more advanced democracy than the British, the Americans, and the Australians have got, because we're fossilised in this old model, which I think came from kicking out the king in about the time of the American Revolution, in the sense that the American Revolution was caused because the Brits were too busy arguing over whether the king should have more or less power, and the king had been inbred and gone mad, right? So you're talking a long time ago. Our democracy was formed historically a long time ago, and it was pretty primitive. Now, the German one the Swiss one was formed in about 1860 or something like that. And they have this form of power where they have about 5 political parties. They do have 2 houses, but instead of saying the decision is made at the top, they say decisions should be made at the lowest level possible. And they have local government, cantons, which kind of correspond to our states, although there's more of them, and they're varying in size for historic reasons. They weren't set up, they evolved rather than being created.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have federal. But in each case, an individual can get signatures and have a plebiscite. So in fact, if you disagreed with a decision the federal government made, you would collect a certain number of signatures in a certain time and have a referendum. And if the referendum was carried, you personally could kick out what the federal government had done, right? And they had a case where they decided the Air Force would get 75 fighter jets, right? And they went and selected the fighter jet, and they said, we're going to get these fighter jets. And people said, hang on, it takes 5 minutes to fly across this country. It is ridiculous that we're going to have an Air Force like this. We're going to do diplomacy. Sorry, we're not going to have any flight. So someone took them on, and they basically kicked the fighter planes out. We're not having any.
Wow.
And we could do something like that for the submarines, right? Because they're no bloody use. They're just going to give us a nuclear industry, make us a nuclear target, and we don't need to attack China anyway. So they're ridiculous, right? But the Swiss could throw it out. We can't, right? Now, if you think the problems are that there's only 2 parties, and whichever you've got to vote for the other one because you've only got 2 options, right? The Swiss have a number of parties, so you don't have that. And the winner doesn't take all. The winner has to negotiate with another couple of parties to put a coalition together to get some legislation through, right? So they get more discussion and more variety, and none of this faction won the party room, that won the party then won the parliament and wins the bloody lot, right? So it goes from a little faction in one party to national legislation immediately, right? And that's what happens. And then because of that, you get, if Biden doesn't succeed, Trump will come back because there ain't no option. That's the only 2 options. Biden gets stymied by conservative forces in the Congress, right? Because he's got a majority of none. He relies on the casting vote. A couple of people defect He can't get anything done. He then becomes ineffective. He's had a go. The only other alternative is the Republicans. Bang, back comes Trump, right? And everyone knows he's a failure, right? So, and we've got the same problem. We've got this binary system. I mean, we've now got Labor not willing to have a policy because they'll get attacked by scare mode, So we would be much better off. And the other thing is it's hierarchical. And this, I don't know if you saw Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, the other.
Yeah, I haven't actually watched the full interview. I should watch it though, but I've seen some snippets. Yeah, interesting stuff.
They were talking about the power structures being very fossilized and very difficult to deal with, right? That was what the essence of what they were saying. And they were relying on, action on sexual harassment. But I would say you could say that about any issue you wanted. The thing is fossilized, and the people are working their way, the politicians are working their way up their hierarchy. Well, the Swiss have fixed this. They said every politician shall be part-time. I think they've got 6 or 7 full-time people and the rest are part-time. And they're only allowed to be in there for 2 years, two terms. So that effectively you can't climb up the party ladder because you're only allowed to be in there for 2 terms. So effectively your superannuation is the fact that if you're in politics, your job is kept open. So that in fact, when you say you do 2 terms in Parliament, you've worked part-time, so you've kept in touch with the job while you were there, and B, your boss has the obligation to employ you when you leave, so that you're on the same salary when you went in. So most people go into politics and say, well, I'll do 2, I'll do, I think they're 4-year terms. I'll do 8 years helping the country, and then I'll go back to what I was doing before. So in a sense, I'll become Lord blah blah. I'll become high up the ladder, and I'll make all these deals, and I'll shaft these people, and I'll look after this lobby group, and I'll look after this lobby group so that I can then work for them when I leave Parliament, and I'll have a huge superannuation, blah blah blah. All that stuff is removed, right? So in a sense, you've got a better chance of people saying, and of course, because they're in there for the common good, they don't say, well, what's the lobby group want? They say, well, hang on, I need to find out about this. Who do I ask? So obviously they don't know more than anybody else. But I mean, our politicians, in my experience, were amazing by their ignorance. Amazing. They didn't really want to know things, most of them. And
gets in the way of their real objectives.
It gets in their way of the ideological position and the policy position that they're being forced to take, right? So there's no point in finding out that you're wrong. Why would you go and do that? Whereas if you say, well, look, I'm there for 8 years, I'm trying to help the country, you'd say, well, I don't know much about this. Let's find out who does, listen to their advice, take it and try and implement it in the time I've got left. So in a sense, the whole model is better, the Swiss model, I think. I mean, it's got its problems, but whatever. But the whole concept of part-time people coming and going over its time, not having a hierarchy, not being binary in the sense that it's only Liberal or Labor or the Democrat. And I think a lot of our problems would be solved by changing the Constitution. And having said that, of course, like America, our Constitution is pretty much fossilized because the small states were, when Australia was created, they had to make it so that the big states wouldn't overrule the little states. So they've given, the Senate's got all this power to Tasmania, and they've got practically no people, and they've got a lot of power. And so that then you have to change the Constitution. You've got to get a yes vote from a majority of people in a majority of states, right? That's very hard to achieve. So the thing is quite fossilized. The Swiss can have referenda every 3 months. And if you want to change the Constitution, I think you've got to get a slightly higher percentage than if you want to change legislation. But they're assuming that the thing will evolve. We're assuming that they got it right in 1900, and that's right for all time. Well, that's a ridiculous proposition, really. The people in 1900 had to try and get 6 bickering states to agree to form a country. That was their problem, right? That wasn't all wisdom for all time. That was, for Christ's sake, let's get this country together. Nowadays, we're more than a century later. We've really got to go to the next step. But we're fossilized. And my view is we've got to try and, everyone says, oh, well, you can't ask for a new constitution. That's a ridiculous thing to ask for. And I say, well, look, hang on. It took me 30 years of campaigning to get rid of tobacco. If we start campaigning for a new constitution with a more enlightened approach and giving the power back to the people, it's just not, they say, oh, it's a radical idea. Well, Switzerland's doing it. Other countries are doing it. We've got to to recognise that we are in a very fossilised, bad model of our political governance. Once you've realised that and start looking for what might be done, and then you say, well, this is radical and the people are making the decisions. Well, the people are not stupid, and this is not, it's not airy-fairy. I mean, the Swiss are doing it already, right? So, and have been for 150 years. So, I mean, the idea that this is radical, I don't think it's radical at all. I think it's just a better model, and we should start thinking about it. And then whenever there's a problem, I think, well, if this was the case, if this was the system, would we have gone into Iraq? No, because 74% of people didn't want to go to Iraq, right? The government took us into Iraq. If they said, do you want to spend a lot of money on nuclear-powered submarines? They would have said no. If they said, do you want to sell Telstra? No. Do you want to give China the port of Darwin? No. Do you want an American base in Darwin? No. Right. A lot of decisions that are made. Do you want Medicare to quietly starve and die? No. Right. I mean, a lot of questions that are the government is deciding in the interests of what I think are lobby groups would not happen if the parliament was in a better model, right? So I think, what should you be campaigning for? Well, in a way, I think let's change the system would be my answer to that.
How realistic do you think that would be, and how long do you think something like a structural change to the government itself would take?
If you ask me, is it realistic in the short term? The answer is, of course, no. If you asked me, if serious people started a serious campaign today, would it be achieved in 30 years? Yes, possibly. I might be dead by then, but that doesn't really matter. And it's not a question of whether I'm alive or not. You know what I mean? If you start on a campaign, then, you hope that at some point it will succeed.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to ask you, and speaking of politics and governments, things like that, I'm a reasonable person. I'm a father as well. I'm in my early 30s. And generally when I hear elected officials talk on TV or politics and things of that nature, my eyes glaze over. I don't understand what they're talking about. And I'm just sort of at a loss with understanding it. But I do care about my country. I care about my fellow Australians. Obviously, I care about the world that I will eventually leave behind for my kids. My question is, what advice would you give to someone like me, young man or a woman, to understand or to begin to wrap their heads around the political process in Australia and why it should be so important to us?
A while ago, I found that I was going to demonstrations and meetings all the time. And, I was saying, God, what campaign can I fight for today? And I found that I was, there were all these campaigns that I thought were worthy, climate change, Aboriginal, violence against women, you name it. You could go, no submarines, no war in Afghanistan, fix the refugees. Every day there's look after the koalas, whatever. There was a million campaigns, right? And I thought, this is ridiculous. We'd go and do demonstrations and stuff, and you'd think, look, you could spend your whole life on this. And I'd spent my whole life, 25 years on the tobacco campaign. Right? I kind of took 20 years out of my life to do that, really. That was my sole focus for 20 years, basically. And I don't regret that. I think it was very useful and probably the most useful thing I'll do, And then I thought, well, why are all these things happening? Why are all these bad things happening? And I thought, well, because the political system isn't working very well. And then I tried to think why that was. And that's why I came to this idea the power has to go back to the people, because the lobby groups and the hierarchical systems of the political parties are currently doing the wrong thing by the people. And they talk about the tragedy of the commons, where, everything was owned in common once, and now everything's been privatised in the sense that everything's owned by an individual. And once it's owned by an individual, if you've played Monopoly, you understand what happens. The people with the most power gradually get most of the money. Money flows upwards because the person at the bottom is in a perfect market. They're competing to be a dunny cleaner with every other person who hasn't got a job. Once you've got a product, you can set the price with a margin. And the higher up the tree you are, the more you can set the price and the higher the margin. So effectively, if you played Monopoly, the Mayfair, once you've got a hotel on Mayfair, as soon as someone else lands on it, they're out of the game because they've got no money, right? So any market will concentrate money upwards. So if the government doesn't keep competition to keep everybody having a reasonable level of profit because they're in competition, when the competition keeps the thing down. Once you've got monopolies, you get into the I own Mayfair position, right? And since the Second World War, you see, the wars were about competition for markets. Germany and Japan were rising economies because they were industrializing. The markets were sewn up by everybody else. And so they launched a war to get at those markets. Now, when they had a conference in Bretton Woods in 1944, they said, how do we stop? We've had 2 wars already this century. How do we stop the next one? And the answer was, we turn the world into a market so that countries that are going well can rise up, and the ones that are doing badly go down, and there isn't any wars, right? Well, that's fine. But then, of course, they had multinationals who went across countries and they could move their taxes to elsewhere and take over the small businesses. And Jeff Coleman, one of the inventors of BUGAUP, was with a group called the Transnational Cooperative, which looked at the effect of this was in the 1980s, the effect of this turning the world into a market, and the fact that the corporations could then rise because they weren't under any particular government. No government could tell them what to do because they would shift the money to a subsidiary or whatever, transferred. And so they would pay no tax. And so they could then compete with the businesses who were in one country and did pay tax, and they could subsidise and cross-subsidise until eventually they wiped out the local competition, and they then became international monopolies. And if you look at pharmaceutical industry, for example, or some of the big agri-businesses, there's only a handful of them in the world setting the world prices, oil, So all this has to be countered because that effectively, that monopoly pricing then sets up for increasing inequality, right? The whole market thing. So there has to be a counter force which brings power back to the people. And that because money is now dictating elections, right? The one with the most money usually wins. And there's been studies in America that shows that only once in the last 50 years or 100 years, or whatever it is, has the campaign that has the less money of the two won.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Because, well, admittedly, partly when you get successful and they think you're going to win, the money comes on board. So there's some. But generally, money is incredibly important. And if you look at our political system where there's only 2 options, right? And in Britain, America, and here, there's really only 2 options, right? That's the problem, because if you haven't got A, you've got to have B, right? By definition. Now, once you're in that situation, and now if you're marketing, and I don't know a lot about marketing, but generally a negative message is 10 times more cost effective than a positive message, right? If I tell you Fred Nurk's a crook, right? And you say, well, thanks, that's the inside info. Fred Nurk can spend 10 times as much money as my remark cost, and you still won't believe he's a good guy, right? So most of the campaigning of Trump, particularly, but of ScoMo in the last election was all negative. There was no positive. I mean, Kroll Shorten said, I've got all these good policies, and ScoMo said he'll put your death taxes up and take away your franking credits, mate. And everyone said, I don't know what a franking credit is, but it sounds bad. And ScoMo got in with no policies, and he's now demonstrated for 3 years that he's got no policies, right? He's been totally inept in everything he's done, pretty much. Now, that's you can call that a biased perspective, if you will. The point is, negative campaigning has become the way to go. But if both sides do negative campaigning, the only conclusion is they're all hopeless, right? They've both told me, they spent all their money telling me that the other one's hopeless. I reckon they're both right. They're all hopeless. So once you say they're all hopeless, then, well, which is the least hopeless, you started from a very sort of demoralized, low expectation position, right?
That's exactly
you haven't
right.
said, well,
Yeah.
how can we have a sensible discussion and get the best policy? You say, oh, no, it's all terrible. X is better than Y, we'll go along that way.
The lesser of two evils.
Lesser of two evils. So you've demeaned the whole political process. You've taken away hope, and you've got the market replacing God in terms of what's going to happen. The market will decide. Well, the market is very good at allocating which are the best bananas in the market, right? Using a competitive model. But that's not the answer. Prevention never gets any money because there's no person directly benefiting from prevention. Right? And not everything can be sold as a product. Some things are actually costs. If you demand that the public transport network make a profit, right? Which they're just doing about rail in New South Wales. Yeah, have to make profit. The rail has to make profit. Well, if you had a really good rail network, you wouldn't need the roads, right? So you would save $1 squillion on road repairs, cars, air pollution, parking stations, right? Now, whether the trains themselves made a profit is a very small factor in that overall picture. But to demand that everything makes a profit because that's our market model is a real limitation of your thinking. You've got to say, what's the bigger picture here? And I'm not saying everything should make a loss. That's a ridiculous proposition also. But, you want to run something well, and you want to run it using as many thoughtful considerations as you can have. And I believe that does require an intelligent government looking at its options rather than having a dogma, everything's got to make a profit. Some things will and some things won't, and they'll cross-subsidise, So I think when I was saying, well, what demonstration will I go to today? Which cause will I fight? That's what brought me back to, hang on, I want to take a much more basic and systemic view. And that's why I guess the two things I'm interested in at the moment is Medicare, because I see the medical system in Australia going the American way by stealth. They're killing Medicare quietly and slowly and subsidising private health insurance, which is subsidising inequality, basically. And subsidising inequality is a very bad thing to do. And we've got a lot of subsidising of inequality. We've never had more subsidising of inequality than we have now, in my view. As the government has shrunk, it's stopped trying to give us an equal society. It's now tribal. We look after our voters and bugger the rest,
Yeah. I saw a video of you talking about Medicare, and again, it's well out of the realm of my understanding, that type of thing. But it was interesting to hear you talk about the history of Medicare and what it was initially intended for, and some of the changes that took place you weren't so fond of. I really appreciate your time, obviously, and I appreciate all the work that you've done around tobacco and around health, and I guess with BUGAUP as well. I really appreciate and I respect what you did all those years ago to highlight issues and what you've done throughout your career. I think it's a really commendable career path that you've taken to speak out, and you've been very outspoken. I really respect you for that, and I really thank you for the work that you've done.
Well, thank you very much too. I mean, if you've got, I don't know how many people listen to your podcast, but if I'm getting to a few hundreds or thousands of people that I wasn't getting to before, I mean, it's not much good me sitting here in my lounge room chatting away to whoever happens to come to the door or whatever friends I've got. Obviously, I think the ideas are important, and getting people to have new ideas. To the extent my ideas are new, if they can get out there and people will actually act, because things aren't going to change if people don't do stuff. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you for listening to the Lead Poison Podcast.
talking to me? Oh yeah? Huh? Okay.
Huh?